There is something about old stone, the way it holds light differently than newer materials do, something patient in its surface, as though time itself has settled into the grain. I think about this often when I picture the earliest gathering places, the places where people first came together not to trade goods or worship gods, but simply to learn, to ask questions, to turn knowledge over in their hands like a smooth river stone. Long before there were buildings we would recognize as universities, there were spaces, courtyards, covered walkways, rooms where voices echoed softly against plaster walls, and in these spaces something remarkable was happening, something that would shape the entire arc of human thought. The air in such places must have felt different, charged with a particular quality of attention, the kind that comes when minds gather not for survival or commerce, but for understanding itself. I imagine the light in those early rooms, how it would slant through doorways in the morning, catch particles of dust suspended in stillness, illuminate the faces of those who sat in circles or stood in rows, listening, questioning, beginning to build the architecture of organized learning. These were not always grand places. Not at first. Sometimes they were simply homes, or temples, or public squares where a teacher known for wisdom would speak, and others would gather, drawn by something magnetic in the promise of knowledge. The very oldest of these gathering places existed in civilizations we now study as ancient, in river valleys where agriculture first flourished and gave people the luxury of time to wonder, time to systematize what they knew about mathematics and astronomy, medicine and philosophy. In one part of the world, along the banks of the Nile, there were houses of life, institutions attached to temples where scribes learned their intricate craft, where the knowledge of healing and the movements of stars was preserved in careful hieroglyphs on papyrus scrolls. In another region, in the valleys between great rivers, there were tablet houses, eduba they were called, where students as young as 7 or 8 would begin the long process of learning cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay, copying proverbs and mathematical tables, studying the administrative skills that kept kingdoms functioning, and further east still, in the fertile plains where another great civilization took root, there were forest academies, places of instruction that blended spiritual teaching with the systematic study of logic, grammar, astronomy, everything that made up the body of knowledge considered essential. But it was in other places too, places where the Mediterranean sun fell warm on marble steps, where a different kind of institution began to take shape, not attached to temples or palaces, but existing almost for its own sake, the academy, the lyceum, names that still resonate across millennia, founded by philosophers whose names we still speak, Plato, Aristotle, men who believed that the pursuit of a knowledge was among the highest callings. That understanding the nature of reality and virtue and beauty was worth dedicating entire lives to. These were not universities as we would recognize them now. There were no degrees, no formal curricula in the modern sense, but they were something. They were sustained communities of inquiry, places where students came to study under masters, where dialogue was method and philosophy was practice. The Lyceum had covered walkways where Aristotle would walk while teaching. Peripatetic, they called this style, and students would follow, walking and thinking and questioning, their footsteps a rhythm beneath the flow of ideas. There was something almost magical in this image. Learning as movement, thought as journey, the body and mind engaged together in the work of understanding. And these institutions persisted, some for centuries, becoming anchors in their cities, places of continuity even as empires rose and fell around them. When I think of those ancient schools, I think of papyrus scrolls stacked in cedar boxes, of clay tablets arranged on shelves, of memory trained to hold vast quantities of poetry and law, of knowledge as something precious, carefully guarded, slowly transmitted from one generation to the next. The world was smaller then, in some ways, and larger in others, and the repositories of learning were points of light, scattered, each one holding and protecting what had been discovered, what had been thought, what had been imagined about the nature of all things. Something shifted in the world around the 7th century. A new force was rising, sweeping across deserts and mountains, carrying with it not just armies and trade routes, but ideas, manuscripts, an intense hunger for knowledge that would reshape the intellectual landscape of 3 continents. In the new Islamic civilization that spread from the Arabian Peninsula across North Africa and into Spain, across Persia and beyond, there emerged a profound reverence for learning, a belief that seeking knowledge was itself a sacred duty. And this belief gave birth to institutions that would preserve and expand human understanding during centuries when much of Europe had turned inward. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, Beit al-Hikmah, established in the early 9th century, became perhaps the most famous of these centers. Though it was far from the only one, scholars gathered there from every corner of the known world, Muslims and Christians and Jews, speaking Arabic and Greek and Persian and Syriac, united by curiosity and the conviction that truth was worth pursuing wherever it led. In these houses of wisdom, translation was revolution. Ancient Greek texts that might have been lost forever were rendered into Arabic. Works of Aristotle and Plato, Galen and Ptolemy, Euclid and Archimedes, flowing from one language into another, carrying mathematics and medicine and philosophy across the bridge of words. But this was not mere preservation. It was transformation. Islamic scholars did not simply copy what the Greeks had written. They questioned, experimented, added their own observations and innovations. Algebra became a systematic discipline. Algorithms were refined. The concept of zero traveled from India and was woven into a new mathematical language. Medical knowledge expanded in ways that would have astonished the ancient physicians. Hospitals became places of teaching as well as healing. Students would accompany experienced doctors on their rounds, observing symptoms, learning treatments, studying the human body with systematic rigor in cities like Cairo, Damascus, Cordoba. Great mosques became centers of learning. Students would sit in circles around scholars who taught jurisprudence and theology, but also grammar and poetry, astronomy and mathematics. The division between sacred and secular knowledge was not as sharp as it would later become. The Al-Azhar in Cairo, founded in the late 10th century, still stands today, one of the oldest continuously operating educational institutions in the world. For more than 1,000 years, it has been a place where students come to study, to debate, to immerse themselves in texts and traditions. In Cordoba, under Moorish rule, the library held hundreds of thousands of volumes. in an age when many European monasteries might possess only a few dozen books. Here were works of science and philosophy, poetry and history, available to scholars who traveled from distant lands to study. Madrasas began to appear throughout the Islamic world, institutions with endowments, buildings designed specifically for teaching, residential quarters for students. These were not quite universities in the medieval European sense that would develop later, but they were formalized, structured, sustainable. The Nizamiya in Baghdad, established in the 11th century, became a model for other institutions. It had salaried professors, a standardized curriculum, students who came to study Islamic law and theology primarily, but who also engaged with logic and linguistics, disputation and debate. Meanwhile, in another part of the world entirely, ancient traditions of learning were continuing, evolving, taking forms that reflected very different philosophical foundations. In China, the imperial examination system was shaping education in profound ways. Though it had roots stretching back centuries earlier, it reached a kind of maturity during the Tang Dynasty and would continue for more than a millennium. This was not a university system, but it was an educational structure. Young men would spend years, sometimes decades, studying classical texts, memorizing poetry and philosophy, learning to write in the elaborate styles required for the examinations, competing for positions in the civil bureaucracy that governed a vast empire. The Confucian classics formed the heart of this education. Texts about proper conduct and governance, about the relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, friend and friend. These were not merely books to be read, but wisdom to be internalized, guides for living and thinking. Academies appeared, some sponsored by the state, others private institutions where scholars gathered students. The White Deer Grotto Academy, the Uelu Academy, places where learning was pursued in settings of natural beauty, often in mountains, surrounded by forests and streams, as though the landscape itself was part of the pedagogy. There was something contemplative about this approach to education, the assumption that wisdom required not just intellect but character, that the scholar should be a certain kind of person, not merely knowledgeable, but cultivated, refined in judgment and sensibility. And in India, ancient traditions of learning persisted and transformed. The great monastery universities of Nalanda and Vikramashila drew students from across Asia. Nalanda in particular became legendary, a vast complex of buildings, libraries, meditation halls, lecture rooms. Thousands of students lived and studied there, learning Buddhist philosophy and logic, but also medicine, mathematics, astronomy, linguistics. The curriculum was rigorous. Debates were fierce intellectual contests. The standards for teachers were exacting. The library at Nalanda was said to be housed in 3 great buildings, one of them 9 stories tall, filled with manuscripts and treatises. When the monastery was destroyed in the late 12th century by invading forces, the books reportedly burned for months, smoke rising from centuries of accumulated knowledge going up in flames. But while Nalanda burned, something new was beginning to stir in Europe, something that would eventually become the institution we now most immediately recognize when we hear the word university. In the medieval towns of Italy and France and England, in the 12th and 13th centuries, a different kind of educational community was forming, not exactly planned, not decreed into existence by kings or caliphs, but emerging almost organically from the needs of the students and the ambitions of teachers. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, these names mark the beginning of something. In Bologna, it was the study of law that drew students. Roman law was being rediscovered, systematized. Young men came to study under masters who could explain the ancient legal codes, who could train them for careers in church or state administration. The students in Bologna organized themselves, formed associations, guilds almost. They hired the teachers, negotiated fees, demanded value for their money. This was remarkable in its way. Students as the organizing force, holding collective power. In Paris, it happened differently. There, the masters organized themselves, teachers of theology and philosophy, of the liberal arts. They formed a guild too, Universitas Magistrorum, a corporation of masters, and this guild gradually gained autonomy, the right to grant licenses to teach, the power to set curricula and standards. The word university itself comes from this universitas, meaning a guild or corporation, an association of people joined for a common purpose. Initially, it did not mean a place of higher learning. It meant the community itself, the collective entity of masters or students bound together. These early universities had no campuses in the modern sense, no quadrangles or college greens. Classes met in rented rooms, in churches. Students lodged wherever they could find space. The university was not a place, but a network, a legal entity, a community defined by relationships and recognized privileges rather than by walls and gates. The curriculum that emerged in these institutions drew heavily on the texts that had been preserved and translated in the Islamic world. Aristotle became central again to European thought, not in Greek but in Latin translations made from Arabic versions, sometimes translations of translations, ideas traveling vast distance through multiple linguistic transformations. Young students would begin with the liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, the 7 traditional disciplines that constituted the foundation of a learning. These were not specialties but prerequisites, the tools needed for further study. After completing the arts, students might proceed to one of the higher faculties, law, medicine, theology. These were the prestigious disciplines, the ones that led to careers and status. Theology especially was considered the queen of sciences, the ultimate application of human reason to the most important questions. The method of teaching was distinctive. Lectures where masters would read and comment on authoritative texts, but also disputations, formal debates where students would argue positions, defend theses against objections, learn to think through structured disagreement. There was something ritualized about these disputations, almost theatrical. Questions would be posed, objections raised, distinctions made, authorities cited. The goal was not just to win an argument, but to demonstrate mastery of logical method, to show that one could think with precision and defend positions with rigor. Degrees emerged as markers of achievement. The bachelor's degree originally meant something like apprentice, someone who had completed a basic training. The master's degree meant one was qualified to teach, licensed by the Guild of Masters to join their ranks. The doctorate was the highest level. A doctor was someone who could lecture on the most advanced texts, who had proven extraordinary learning. These universities gained remarkable privileges, exemption from local taxes, the right to their own courts of law, protection from city authorities who might otherwise interfere. Kings and popes granted these freedoms because universities served important functions, training lawyers and administrators, theologians and physicians, the skilled professionals that medieval society needed. Oxford and Cambridge emerged in England, their origins somewhat murky, perhaps splitting off from Paris, perhaps forming independently, clusters of masters and students gathering in these particular towns, beginning to develop the collegiate system that would become their distinctive feature. Colleges were originally endowed halls where students could live and study, founded by wealthy patrons, bishops, nobles. Gradually, these colleges became the defining structure, each with its own buildings, chapel, library, dining hall, creating the physical forms we now associate with ancient universities. The rhythm of life in these medieval universities had a particular quality, a kind of structured intensity that shaped the days and seasons of everyone within them. Students arrived young, sometimes as young as 14 or 15, leaving their families and traveling to university towns that might be days or weeks of journey from home, carrying letters of introduction, small amounts of money, perhaps a few books if their families were wealthy enough to own any. The language of instruction was Latin, always Latin, regardless of whether one studied in Bologna or Paris or Prague or Salamanca. This created a kind of universal intellectual currency. A student could move from one university to another and continue their studies. The texts were the same. The methods were the same. The language was the same. Morning bells would ring in the cold darkness of winter, summoning students to early lectures. They would gather in unheated rooms, breath visible in the air, huddled in whatever warm clothing they possessed, while a master read from a manuscript by candlelight, commenting, explaining, interpreting texts that had been studied for centuries. Books were precious objects, rare and expensive. A single manuscript might cost as much as a house. Students could not own their own copies of most texts. They would rent them from stationers, take them for a few days or weeks, copy out portions by hand, return them, gradually building their own collections of notes and excerpts. The stationer's shop was a crucial institution, holding copies of standard texts that students needed, renting them out in sections called PCA, so that multiple students could be copying different parts of the same book simultaneously, maximizing access to limited resources. Memory was cultivated as a kind of technology. Students would memorize vast portions of texts, entire arguments of Aristotle or passages from Scripture, debates from the Church Fathers. This was not just for examinations, but for thinking itself. One needed to carry knowledge internally, to have it available for immediate recall during disputations or discussions. The disputation was training in a particular form of rigorous thought. A student would be assigned a question, perhaps whether the soul is immortal, or whether a king's authority comes from God or from the people, and they would have to argue both sides, first presenting the strongest possible arguments against the position they would ultimately defend, then systematically answering those objections. This taught a kind of intellectual empathy, the ability to understand opposing viewpoints from within, to give them their full weight before attempting to refute them. It was training in fairness of mind, in the discipline of not dismissing what one disagreed with. Life outside the lecture halls was often rowdy, chaotic. Students were young men far from home, living in crowded conditions, frequently poor, often drunk. Town gown conflicts were common. Fights would break out between students and local townspeople, sometimes escalating into riots that left people dead. Universities would sometimes threaten to move entirely, to cease. This was a powerful threat because a university brought money and prestige to a town, thousands of students and masters needing housing and food and services. When the University of Paris went on strike or threatened to relocate, the city would often capitulate to demands. Nations within universities were another form of organization. Students from different regions would form associations. The English nation, the Norman nation, the Picard nation, these provided mutual support, a kind of family away from family, and also competed with each other, sometimes violently. The ceremonies of university life had weight and solemnity. The granting of degrees was accompanied by elaborate ritual, oaths taken, caps placed on heads, kisses exchanged. These were not mere formalities, but transformations, marking the passage from student to master, from learner to authority. New universities proliferated across Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. Salamanca in Spain, Padua in Italy, Heidelberg and Cologne in the German lands, Krakow in Poland, each chartered by pope or emperor or both, each granted the precious right to confer degrees recognized across Christendom. The universitas was an international phenomenon, transcending local boundaries. A master who earned his degree in Paris could teach in Prague. Students circulated from one university to another, seeking particular teachers or specialties, building networks that stretched across the continent. Theology remained the pinnacle of study. The Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century represented a kind of apotheosis of medieval university thought, an attempt to synthesize all of philosophy and theology into one coherent system, to reconcile Aristotle with Christian doctrine, to answer every possible objection to every possible question about God and creation and human nature. The scholastic method that emerged in these universities was both powerful and limiting, powerful in its rigor, its insistence on logical coherence, its willingness to engage with difficult questions through structured argument, limiting in its reverence for authority, its tendency to remain within established frameworks rather than questioning fundamental assumptions. Medicine, as taught in medieval universities, was a mixture of ancient wisdom and elaborate theory, based heavily on Galen and the Arabic physicians, on the theory of the four humors, blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile, whose balance supposedly determined health and temperament. Medical students would study texts, learn to diagnose by examining urine and checking pulses, memorize the properties of herbs and minerals, but dissection of human bodies was rare, sometimes forbidden, sometimes performed once a year as a kind of demonstration where the professor would read from Galen while a barber surgeon did the actual cutting. The study of law was perhaps more immediately practical. Canon law for the governance of the church, civil law for secular courts and administration. Students learned elaborate systems of procedure and precedent, how to construct arguments from authoritative texts, how to navigate the complex legal structures of medieval society. Universities became training grounds for the administrative class that medieval kingdoms needed, men who could read and write Latin, keep accounts, draft documents, negotiate treaties, staff the growing bureaucracies of church and state. But there was also a dimension of pure intellectual inquiry. Questions pursued not for their practical application, but for their own sake, debates about the nature of universals, whether they existed independently or only in particular things, about the relationship between faith and reason, about infinity and contingency and necessity. These questions could become intensely controversial. Positions could be condemned as heretical. Teachers could be forced to recant. Books could be burned. The line between legitimate inquiry and dangerous innovation was not always clear, and universities existed in tension between freedom of inquiry and doctrinal orthodoxy. The Black Death in the 14th century devastated universities, along with everything else. Masters and students died by the thousands. Some universities closed temporarily. Others lost half their members or more. The disruption was profound, yet the institutions survived, rebuilt, continued. In some ways, the plague accelerated change, created opportunities for new ideas as old authorities died, loosened the grip of tradition simply through the chaos and loss. The world that emerged afterward was not quite the same as the one before. The 15th century brought new currents of thought. Humanism began to challenge scholastic methods. Scholars became interested in recovering ancient texts in their original languages, in studying Greek and Hebrew, in reading classical authors not as authorities to be reconciled with Christian doctrine, but as voices from another world, worthy of attention on their own terms. Universities were sometimes receptive to these new interests, sometimes resistant. The humanists often criticized university education as sterile, focused on empty logical quibbles rather than elegant expression and moral wisdom. The universities in turn saw humanism as superficial, concerned with style over substance. New universities founded in the 15th century sometimes reflected humanist ideals more fully, emphasis on rhetoric and poetry alongside philosophy, study of classical literature in the original languages, a vision of education aimed at cultivating eloquent, virtuous, broadly learned individuals rather than narrow specialists. The printing press changed everything, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Books that once had to be laboriously copied by hand could now be produced by the hundreds, the thousands. Suddenly, the price of a book fell to a fraction of what it had been. Suddenly, students could own their own copies of texts, could read widely rather than intensively. Universities had to adapt to this abundance. The lecture format, where a master read and commented on a rare text, made less sense when students could read the text themselves. The relationship between teacher and student began to shift towards something more like guidance than transmission. The Protestant Reformation fractured the universal world that medieval universities had inhabited. Suddenly, there were competing orthodoxies, Catholic universities and Protestant universities, different versions of truth, different authorities. The assumption of a single Christendom united in faith and no longer held. New universities were founded explicitly as Protestant institutions. Marburg, Königsberg, Geneva, places where Reformed theology would be taught, where ministers would be trained in the new doctrines, where the Bible in vernacular languages would be studied alongside or instead of Latin texts. Catholic universities responded with their own reforms. The Jesuits became particularly influential in education, founding colleges and universities across Europe and beyond. With rigorous curricula, emphasis on classical learning, but also firm doctrinal control, the Ratio Studiorum standardized Jesuit education into a systematic method. The 16th and 17th centuries saw universities caught between tradition and transformation, still teaching much of the medieval curriculum, still granting degrees according to ancient patterns, but also beginning to make space for new forms of knowledge. Natural philosophy was starting to become something different, something more like what we would call science. Observation and experiment were gaining prestige alongside logical argument and textual authority, though universities were often not the primary sites of these developments. The great scientific advances of the 17th century often happened outside universities, in royal societies and private correspondence, in workshops and observatories. Galileo and Newton were university men in some sense, but their revolutionary work was not necessarily welcomed by university authorities. Universities gradually, sometimes reluctantly, began to incorporate new knowledge into their structures. Chairs in mathematics and astronomy appeared. Botanical gardens were established for the study of medicinal plants. Anatomical theaters were built where dissections could be performed before audiences of students. The University of Leiden in the Netherlands became known for its progressive approach, welcoming religious diversity, encouraging empirical investigation, building one of the finest libraries and botanical gardens in Europe. Students came from across the continent, drawn by its reputation for openness and intellectual vitality. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and progress, its confidence that human understanding could unlock the secrets of nature and improve society, and universities responded to these currents in varied ways. Some remained bastions of tradition. Oxford and Cambridge in particular became somewhat somnolent, dominated by clergy, focused on classical education, resistant to change, producing gentlemen rather than scholars, places where students of means could acquire polish and connections more than learning. But elsewhere, especially in Scotland and the German lands, universities were experiencing renewal. The University of Edinburgh became a center of Enlightenment thought. David Hume and Adam Smith were associated with Scottish universities. Medical education in Edinburgh was particularly distinguished. The University of Göttingen, founded in the mid-18th century, represented a new model. It emphasized research alongside teaching, built an exceptional library, recruited distinguished professors, encouraged the seminar method where small groups would work closely with a master on advanced topics. This German model would eventually transform higher education worldwide. The idea that a university should be a place of original research, that professors should not merely transmit established knowledge, but create new knowledge. This was revolutionary in its implications. The seminar room became a new kind of space, intimate, focused, where advanced students would work through primary sources, learn methods of investigation, contribute to ongoing projects under a professor's guidance. This was training in scholarship itself, in how to ask questions and pursue answers systematically. Wilhelm von Humboldt's founding of the University of Berlin in the early 19th century crystallized these ideals, the unity of teaching and research, academic freedom, Bildung as the goal, this German word difficult to translate, meaning something like cultivation, the development of the whole person through rigorous intellectual engagement. Universities in the German lands multiplied and flourished, each state wanting its own institution, each competing for distinguished scholars. The idea of the research university, the professor as investigator rather than merely instructor, took deep root. The natural sciences began to gain equal standing with the traditional faculties. Laboratories were built, equipped with increasingly sophisticated instruments. Chemistry and physics and biology became systematic disciplines, with methods and standards and communities of practitioners. The 19th century was a period of tremendous expansion. Universities spread across the European colonial empires to India and Australia and South Africa and beyond, carrying European models of higher education around the globe, though not without modification and resistance. In the United States, colleges had existed since the colonial period. Small institutions modeled on Oxford and Cambridge focused on classical education and moral formation, training ministers and gentlemen, but after independence, higher education began to evolve in distinctive directions. State universities appeared, funded by public money, meant to serve broader populations. The Morrill Act of 1862 granted federal land to states for establishing colleges focused on agriculture and mechanical arts, practical education for an expanding democracy. American universities also began to adopt elements of the German research model. Graduate schools appeared. The PhD became the terminal degree for scholars. Johns Hopkins University, founded in 1876, was explicitly modeled on German principles, dedicated to research and advanced training. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw universities grow dramatically in size and scope. Science and technology became central. Engineering programs expanded. Social sciences emerged as distinct disciplines. Economics and sociology and political science, each claiming scientific status and systematic methods. Women's access to higher education was a long struggle, fought institution by institution, country by country. Some universities admitted women grudgingly, others refused for decades. Separate women's colleges were founded in many places, creating spaces where women could pursue serious scholarship, even as established universities excluded them. The first women to enter universities faced extraordinary obstacles: isolation, hostility, assumptions that they were intellectually inferior or that education would damage their health or fertility. Yet they persisted, and gradually, though far too slowly, doors opened. Professional schools proliferated. Business schools, schools of education, social work, journalism. The university was becoming comprehensive, encompassing more and more forms of specialized knowledge, training for an expanding array of careers and occupations. Had in the 20th century brought acceleration. 2 world wars disrupted universities profoundly, but also connected them to national projects, military research, code breaking, physics departments working on radar and atomic bombs. The line between pure research and practical application became increasingly blurred. After the Second World War, universities expanded massively. The GI Bill in the United States sent millions of veterans to college. Higher education was democratizing, becoming accessible to broader segments of society, no longer the preserve of elites alone. New universities were founded by the dozens, then hundreds, in the developing world as newly independent nations invested in higher education as part of nation building. These institutions often struggled with limited resources and political interference, but they represented aspirations, the conviction that universities were essential to modernity and progress. The Cold War shaped universities in ways both obvious and subtle. Funding flowed to scientific research, especially in physics and engineering. Area studies programs emerged to study rivals and allies. Universities became sites of competition between systems, showcases for different visions of society. The late 20th century brought new challenges and transformations. The explosion of information technology, the internet connecting scholars across continents instantaneously, databases and digital libraries making vast amounts of material accessible, changing the fundamental conditions of research and learning. Universities grew more complex, more bureaucratic, administration expanded, rankings and metrics became obsessions. Competition for students and faculty and funding intensified. The publish or perish culture of academia created pressures that sometimes seemed at odds with the contemplative ideals of scholarship. Disciplines fragmented into ever narrower specializations. The common curriculum that once united educated people gave way to increasingly technical training in particular fields. Communication across disciplines became difficult. The polymath gave way to the expert. Yet universities also became more diverse in who attended, in what was studied, in methods and approaches. Ethnic studies and women's studies and queer studies challenged traditional canons. Post-colonial scholars questioned Western-centric frameworks. New voices demanded to be heard. The early 21st century found universities navigating multiple tensions between teaching and research, between basic and applied knowledge, between academic freedom and public accountability, between tradition and innovation, between local roots and global reach. Online education emerged as both promise and threat. Massive open online courses reached thousands of students simultaneously. Distance learning made higher education accessible to people who could never attend a traditional campus, but also raised questions about what a university fundamentally is. Is it the information transmitted, the credentials granted, or is it something else? The community of inquiry, the sustained mentorship, the space set apart for questioning and thinking, the physical gathering of minds in libraries and laboratories and classrooms. The COVID-19 pandemic forced a sudden experiment. Universities went online almost overnight. Lectures became video streams. Discussions happened in chat windows. Laboratories closed. Campuses emptied. And everyone discovered both the possibilities and the limitations of virtual learning. Some things could be replicated online. Content could be delivered. Even discussions could happen. But something was lost. The casual conversations after class, the chance encounter in the library, the late-night arguments in dormitories, the way ideas circulate in physical proximity. As campuses slowly reopened, there was renewed appreciation for the embodied nature of university life, for presence and place. Even as online elements remained, hybrid models emerged, flexible and adaptive, trying to capture benefits of both approaches. Through all these transformations, universities remained distinctive institutions, neither fully autonomous nor fully controlled by states or markets, spaces with their own logics and rhythms, their own traditions and cultures, still recognizable as descendants of those medieval guilds of masters and students. The rituals persist, academic processions in ceremonial robes, the conferring of degrees with ancient formulas, the architecture that still often echoes Gothic or classical forms, as though continuity with the past matters, as though universities are meant to be bridges between generations. And perhaps they are. Perhaps that is part of their deepest purpose, to receive knowledge from the past, to investigate and expand it in the present, to transmit it to the future, to be places where time moves at a different pace than the urgent rhythms of commerce and politics. Libraries remain at the heart of many universities, now digital as well as physical. Vast collections accumulated over centuries, resources for scholars pursuing questions that might take years or decades to answer. Investments in futures we cannot fully predict. The university campus itself has become a particular kind of landscape. Quadrangles and pathways worn smooth by countless footsteps, buildings that carry names of donors and distinguished scholars, spaces designed to encourage certain kinds of movement and meeting and thought. There is something about walking across a university campus in the early morning or late evening, when the light slants across stone or brick, when the buildings stand quiet, holding within them all the lectures and debates and discoveries and disappointments that have unfolded there, all the minds that have struggled with difficult questions in those rooms. Universities exist in a strange relationship with time. They are conservative institutions by nature, preserving traditions, maintaining continuity across generations, yet they are also engines of change, places where new ideas emerge that eventually transform society. This tension lives in the very architecture. Ancient buildings housing the latest equipment, stone walls enclosing laboratories where researchers manipulate atoms and genes, Gothic arches framing screens displaying data from satellites orbiting the Earth. The medieval student and the contemporary undergraduate are separated by centuries, yet something connects them. The experience of encountering ideas that challenge what one thought one knew, the vertigo of realizing how much one does not understand, the slow expansion of comprehension as patterns become visible. There is a quality of attention that universities are designed to cultivate, sustained, deep, willing to sit with difficulty and ambiguity. This is increasingly rare in a world of quick answers and constant distraction, yet it remains essential for certain kinds of understanding. The seminar discussion where a group puzzles through a complex text together, the laboratory meeting where researchers consider unexpected results, the office hours conversation where a student's confusion gradually resolves into clarity. These moments cannot be rushed. They require patience and presence. Universities hold knowledge in trust. The dissertation buried in library stacks that no one has opened in decades, but that represents years of someone's work. The data carefully archived in case future researchers need it. The collections maintained even when fashions change. This is a long view, a conviction that we don't always know what will prove valuable. There is something monastic about this. The scholar in the archive spending months with obscure manuscripts, the scientist running experiment after experiment, the philosopher working through arguments with painstaking precision. These are not people chasing immediate impact or visible success. They are pursuing understanding for its own sake. And yet, universities also train most of the professionals who keep complex societies functioning: doctors and engineers, teachers and lawyers. The expertise that makes modern life possible is largely transmitted through universities. This dual nature, contemplative and practical, remains unresolved. The question of what should be taught is perennially contested. Should universities focus on enduring questions and classical texts, or on current problems and practical skills? Should they cultivate broad learning or specialized expertise? There are good arguments in multiple directions, and the balance shifts with time and place. Perhaps both matter. Perhaps the engineer needs philosophy, and the philosopher needs science. Perhaps the compartmentalization of knowledge into isolated disciplines is itself a problem that universities should resist even as their structures encourage it. The global dimensions of universities have intensified. Students cross oceans for education. Faculty collaborate with colleagues on other continents. Research teams span time zones. Yet this raises questions too. Whose knowledge counts? Whose languages and frameworks are centered? Who sets the standards and determines excellence? Universities in the West have often assumed their models were universal, that their methods and values should be adopted everywhere. But there are other intellectual traditions, other ways of organizing learning and inquiry, other questions worth asking. The challenge is to be genuinely international without being imperial. Indigenous knowledge systems, oral traditions that carry ecological wisdom accumulated over millennia, communal ways of learning that do not fit academic individualism. These have often been dismissed or marginalized by universities, yet they contain understanding that written texts alone cannot capture. Some universities are beginning to grapple with this, to ask how they can honor multiple epistemologies, how traditional knowledge and modern science might speak to each other. These are difficult conversations, requiring humility and a willingness to question fundamental assumptions. The climate crisis and other urgent challenges raise questions about the purposes of universities. Is pure research a luxury when the planet is burning? Or is it precisely when we face existential threats that we most need deep thinking and long-term perspective? Both positions have force. The tension is real. Universities contain multitudes. The cutting-edge research laboratory and the dusty archive, the lecture hall where hundreds gather, and the quiet carrel where one student reads alone, the fierce competition for grants and publications, and the generous sharing of ideas and methods. All of this coexists, sometimes uneasily. There are scholars who spend entire careers on questions that most people would never think to ask. The mating habits of obscure insects, the grammatical structures of endangered languages, the theological disputes of forgotten sects. This seems absurd from certain angles, yet it represents a conviction that knowledge itself has value, that understanding the world in its particularity and complexity is worthwhile, and sometimes, often unexpectedly, something from these obscure corners turns out to matter enormously. The mathematician working on abstract number theory, whose results later enable cryptography. The researcher studying peculiar bacteria that produces an antibiotic. We cannot always predict what will prove useful. The university as an ideal remains compelling, a place set apart from immediate pressures, where ideas can be pursued wherever they lead, where young minds encounter the accumulated wisdom of humanity and learn to think for themselves, where the future is being imagined and investigated. The reality is always messier than the ideal. Universities are institutions with all the flaws that institutions have: politics and pettiness, inequities and exclusions, brilliant moments and grinding bureaucracy, sacred spaces and parking lots, both at once. Yet they persist, adapting, evolving, still drawing students who hunger for understanding, still sheltering scholars pursuing questions that may take lifetimes to answer, still serving as bridges between past and future, repositories and laboratories, conservative and radical. In the end, perhaps what matters most about universities is not any particular discovery or theory, not the degrees granted or the papers published, but something harder to quantify: the quality of mind they aim to cultivate, the capacity to think clearly and question deeply, to hold multiple perspectives, to change one's mind in light of evidence, to pursue truth even when it is uncomfortable. These are dispositions, habits of thought, more than specific knowledge. Every generation rediscovers the strangeness of universities, institutions that exist partly outside the logic of markets and immediate utility, that take years to train people in disciplines that may never be directly profitable, that value questions that cannot be quickly answered. This seems impractical until one considers the alternatives: a world where all research serves short-term profit, where education is purely vocational, where no one has time to think slowly and carefully about difficult questions. Such a world would be poorer in ways both obvious and subtle. The medieval masters who formed those first guilds of scholars could not have imagined the modern research university, its complexity and scale, its laboratories and supercomputers. Yet they would recognize something: the fundamental commitment to learning, the gathering of minds around questions, the transmission of understanding across generations. Students still arrive uncertain, still struggle with difficult texts and unfamiliar concepts, still experience those moments of sudden clarity when something clicks into place, still form friendships and rivalries, still stay up too late arguing about ideas. The particulars change, but the patterns recur. And there is still something about late evening in a library, the quiet broken only by turning pages and soft footsteps, the pools of light from reading lamps, the sense of being surrounded by knowledge accumulated over centuries, of joining a conversation that began long before one was born and will continue long after. Universities are imperfect vessels, flawed and often failing their own ideals, but they remain among the few institutions explicitly dedicated to understanding, to the patient work of investigation and thought, to the conviction that knowledge matters not just for what it can do, but for what it is. The stone buildings will continue to stand, or new ones will be built. Students will continue to arrive. Uncertain and hopeful, faculty will continue to puzzle over data and texts. Administrators will continue to navigate impossible constraints, and somehow, improbably, the enterprise will continue. Not because universities are inevitable. They are not. They are fragile and contingent. But because every generation rediscovers the need for spaces set apart, where questions can be asked freely, where understanding is pursued patiently, where the mind can stretch and grow, the light slanting through the library windows in the afternoon, the scratch of pen on paper or keys on keyboard, the voice of a teacher explaining something beautiful and difficult, the silence of concentration, the buzz of debate. These continue, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything. This simple ongoing commitment to learning and teaching, to preserving and discovering, to the slow, patient work of understanding our world and ourselves. The universities will change. They must. The world changes and institutions must adapt or die, but something essential might persist. The gathering of minds around questions, the intergenerational conversation, the spaces where time moves differently, where we can pause and think and wonder, and slowly, carefully, build understanding where the long view matters and patience is possible. And the questions asked today might not be answered for generations, but are asked anyway, because understanding itself, the pursuit of truth in all its difficulty and complexity, remains worth everything. I stand at the edge of an idea, and the idea is vast, stretching backward through millennia, through dust and memory, through layers of earth that hold the whispers of something ancient, something foundational. There is a place that exists now only in fragments, in clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, in the geometric patterns of sun-dried brick, in the ghost lines of canals that once carried water through an impossible garden. And tonight, I find myself drawn there, not as a visitor, but as a witness to the slow accumulation of human thought, human ambition, human need. The land between two rivers, that is what the name means. Mesopotamia, from the Greek words for middle and river, though the people who lived there first would not have called it that. They would have known it simply as the world, as the black-headed people, as Sumer, as Akkad, as Babylonia, as the place where the Tigris and Euphrates descend from distant mountains and spread their gift of silt across an otherwise unyielding plain. I imagine standing there in that river valley, 5,000 years removed from electric light, from the hum of engines, from any sound except wind and water and the occasional bleating of sheep in the distance. And I see how the landscape itself is both generous and demanding, how it floods with seasonal precision, depositing rich, dark earth, then recedes, leaving behind the challenge of survival in a place where rain is scarce and summer heat is merciless. The rivers move slowly, their surfaces catching the bronze light of late afternoon, reflecting palm trees that cluster along the banks like patient guardians. And beyond the green ribbon of vegetation, the land extends in shades of ochre and pale gold, flat, seemingly endless, holding secrets in its silence. This is where it began, not all of it, but so much of what we consider the architecture of civilization, the framework upon which cities and laws and literature would be built. And the beginning was not sudden, not a single moment of revelation, but rather a gradual accumulation, like sediment settling layer upon layer, generation upon generation. I think about the first settlements, small clusters of reed houses near the water's edge, people who had learned to plant barley and emmer wheat in the rich soil left by the floods, who had domesticated sheep and goats and cattle, who were beginning to understand that staying in one place, building something permanent, might be possible, might be preferable to the endless movement of the nomadic life. The sun moves across the sky, and with it, the shadows lengthen over mud brick walls that rise higher each generation, over temples that begin as simple shrines and grow into massive stepped pyramids called ziggurats, over marketplaces where goods from distant mountains and far coasts change hands, copper and lapis lazuli and timber and stone. There is something hypnotic about imagining the rhythm of life in these early cities, the way the day would begin before dawn with the lighting of fires, the preparation of bread, the opening of workshops where craftsmen shaped clay and hammered metal and wove textiles, the way the streets would fill with voices speaking Sumerian, later Akkadian, languages that sound in my mind like water over stones, unfamiliar, musical, carrying the weight of human need and human wonder. I see the scribes, seated in the shade of a courtyard, reed styluses in hand, pressing wedge shapes into soft clay tablets, recording grain deliveries, temple offerings, the terms of a marriage contract, the boundaries of a field, and in doing so, creating something unprecedented, a memory outside the human body, a way to speak across time. The cuneiform signs emerge from the clay like constellations, each one a small constellation of marks, triangular impressions that represent not just objects, but sounds, syllables, the building blocks of language made visible, made permanent. And with this technology, this profound invention, the interior life of ancient Mesopotamia begins to reveal itself, not just in administrative records, but in poetry, in prayers, in letters between fathers and sons, in the epic tale of a king who sought immortality and found instead the value of a well-built wall. Night falls over the river valley, and the darkness is complete, except for oil lamps flickering in windows, torches carried by night watchmen, the distant glow of a temple where priests maintain the eternal flame, and above it all, stars so bright and numerous they seem almost close enough to touch, the same stars that Mesopotamian astronomers observed and catalogued with astonishing precision, tracking the movements of planets, predicting eclipses, mapping the heavens with the same meticulous attention they brought to mapping the earth. This is where I begin, in the presence of that ancient darkness, that ancient light, listening for the echoes of voices that spoke of gods and kings, of floods and harvests, of justice and revenge, of love and death, voices that shaped the first written words, the first cities, the first codes of law, voices that still resonate, faint but unmistakable across the enormous distance of time. The story begins much earlier than the cities, begins in a time when the southern plains of Mesopotamia were still marshland and estuary, when the Persian Gulf extended much farther north than it does today, and the people who would eventually become the Sumerians were perhaps still migrating, still searching for a place to settle, their origins obscured by the very success of what they would build. We do not know where they came from, these people who called themselves the black-headed ones, their language unrelated to any other known tongue, standing alone like an island in a sea of Semitic speech. And this linguistic isolation is one of the great mysteries, a question that remains suspended in the space between evidence and imagination. But what we do know is that by around 5,000 years ago, perhaps a few centuries earlier, they were there in the southernmost reaches of the river valley, building something unprecedented. The first settlements were humble, built of bundled reeds plastered with mud, structures that echoed the materials at hand, the papyrus-like reeds that grew in dense thickets along the waterways, and even later, when they learned to make bricks from the river mud. They continued to build with those bundles of reeds incorporated into the design, remembered in the ribbed columns of later temples, architectural memory of origins. Eridu, that is the name that appears in the king lists as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, and archaeological evidence confirms human habitation there going back perhaps 7,000 years, layer upon layer of rebuilding. Temples constructed atop the ruins of earlier temples, each generation raising the sacred platform a little higher, creating over millennia the artificial mountain that would become the signature form of Mesopotamian worship. I imagine the early farmers working the fields in the cooler hours of morning and evening, understanding already that water was everything, that the rivers gave life but also took it away, that floods could destroy as easily as they nourished, and so they began to dig. Simple channels at first, directing water where it was needed, keeping it away from where it would do harm, and these first tentative attempts at irrigation would evolve into something extraordinary, a network of canals and dikes and reservoirs that transformed the landscape, that made civilization possible. By the fourth millennium before the Common Era, settlements were growing into towns, and towns into cities. Uruk rising from the plain like a declaration, its population swelling to perhaps 50,000 people, an almost incomprehensible concentration of humanity for that time, surrounded by 6 miles of defensive walls, dotted with temples whose facades were decorated with colored clay cones pressed into the mud brick to create geometric patterns, red and white and black, glittering in the harsh sunlight. The temple complexes dominated these early cities, vast estates dedicated to the gods, and it was here that the innovations emerged, the need to track offerings, to record the distribution of grain and oil and wool to temple workers, to manage the increasingly complex economy of a settled agricultural society. And this need gave birth to the first writing. The earliest tablets are simple, pictographic. A circle with a cross means sheep. A bowl shape means food or bread. Symbols that represent the objects themselves. But already there is something revolutionary happening, the human mind externalizing its memory, creating a technology that will outlast flesh and bone, that will speak across the silent gulf of death. I see the first scribes, perhaps temple administrators, realizing that these marks could represent not just things but sounds, that the symbol for water could also mean the sound A in the Sumerian language. And with this insight, this leap of abstraction, writing became capable of recording anything, not just inventories, but also stories, prayers, laws, the full complexity of human thought. The cities multiplied, Ur and Lagash and Nippur, Kish and Umma and Larsa, each with its own patron deity, its own agricultural hinterland, its own ambitions, and between them the relationship was sometimes cooperative, sometimes violently competitive. Wars fought over water rights, over boundary stones, over the favor of the gods, and from these conflicts, from the need to organize labor for irrigation projects and defense, came the institution of kingship. The earliest kings were perhaps war leaders, men who proved themselves in battle and then retained authority in peacetime, or they were temple administrators who accumulated enough power to rule in both sacred and secular spheres. And the line between these roles was never clear. The king was always, in some sense, the representative of the gods, the intermediary between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining Mahat, the cosmic order, ensuring that the rituals were performed correctly, that justice was administered, that the walls were strong. The king lists speak of dynasties lasting thousands of years, of rulers who reigned for impossible spans. 36,000 years, 28,800 years, and then, after a great flood, the lengths become more reasonable, more human, and scholars debate whether these early fantastic numbers represent real chronology, compressed and mythologized, or whether they are purely symbolic, expressions of the feeling that time itself was different once, deeper, more sacred. The flood appears again and again in Mesopotamian literature, a catastrophe that divided history, that washed away an earlier world, and whether it refers to a specific historical event, perhaps a devastating inundation around 5,000 years ago, or whether it represents the accumulated memory of countless floods, the existential threat of living between two powerful rivers. The story itself became foundational. The righteous man warned by his God, building a boat, saving the animals, surviving the deluge that was meant to destroy humanity for its noise, its chaos, its failure to properly revere the divine. By the early third millennium, the cities had developed distinct identities. Uruk was a center of craft production and trade, its workshops producing pottery and textiles that spread throughout the region. Ur became wealthy from commerce, its position near the coast, giving it access to goods from the Persian Gulf and beyond. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, copper from Oman, and Nippur held religious authority, its temple to Enlil, the chief god, making it a pilgrimage site, a neutral ground where kings from rival cities could meet and negotiate. The irrigation systems grew more sophisticated, more extensive, main canals feeding into smaller channels, water distributed according to complex schedules and regulations. And this required coordination, required authority, required a bureaucracy capable of managing the flow of water and the disputes that inevitably arose when one city's use affected another's supply. And so the practical necessities of survival in an arid land shaped the political structures, created the need for law, for record keeping, for the apparatus of state. I imagine walking through Uruk in its glory, through streets that follow no grid, winding organically between tightly packed houses, walls rising directly from the narrow alleys, the ground floor windowless for security and coolness, the upper stories sometimes projecting over the street, creating patches of shade, and the houses themselves built around central courtyards, open to the sky, where families cooked and worked and slept under the stars in summer. The sounds would be the sounds of craft, of commerce, the rhythmic pounding of copper being hammered into shape, the clack of the vertical loom as a weaver works, voices haggling over the price of dates or barley, children playing games with knuckle bones, and underlying it all, the murmur of water flowing through the city's canals, the lifeline that makes all of this possible. In the temples, priests performed the daily rituals, clothing the statue of the god, offering food and drink, burning incense, maintaining the relationship between the human and divine realms that ensured fertility, prosperity, victory, And these weren't merely symbolic acts. They were understood as essential maintenance, as necessary as repairing a breach in a canal wall. The cosmos required constant attention, constant propitiation, or it would fall back into chaos. The gods themselves were numerous, each city's patron deity, supreme in their own territory but acknowledged as part of a larger pantheon. And the sky god, Enlil the lord of wind and storm, Enki the god of fresh water and wisdom, Inanna the goddess of love and war. Complex personalities prone to jealousy and anger and occasional mercy, divine beings who mirrored human society, who had families and rivalries and councils, who could be influenced by offerings and prayers, or who might simply act according to their own inscrutable will. And alongside the worship, alongside the daily labor of farming and craft, there was already art, already literature, the cylinder seals carved with intricate scenes, banquets and battles and processions, pressed into wet clay to mark ownership or authority, and poetry, hymns to the gods composed with sophisticated literary techniques, parallelism and repetition and allusion, verses that were performed, chanted in temple ceremonies, preserved on tablets for other scribes to copy and study. This was the foundation, the early phase when the fundamental patterns were established, when humanity was learning to live in unprecedented density, creating the institutions and technologies and cultural forms that would define not just Mesopotamia but all subsequent civilizations, the city, the state, the written word, the law code, the epic poem, all emerging from the silt between two rivers, from the ingenuity born of necessity, from the slow accumulation of knowledge passed from generation to generation, each one building on what came before, raising the platform a little higher, creating something that would endure long after the rivers changed course and the cities fell silent. The transition from the early dynastic period into what scholars call the Akkadian Empire marks a profound shift, not just in political organization, but in the very conception of what power could mean, what territory could encompass. And this transformation centers on a single figure whose historicity is debated, but whose impact is undeniable. Sargon of Akkad, a name that means true king and may itself be a title rather than a birth name, a man who rose from obscurity to create something unprecedented. The legends say he was born in secret, placed in a reed basket and set adrift on the river, discovered and raised by a gardener, later becoming cupbearer to the king of Kish. And whether these details are historical or borrowed from mythic archetypes, they speak to the revolutionary nature of his rise, a commoner who seized power, who unified the squabbling city-states under a single authority, who extended his control from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, creating the first true empire in human history. Around 4,300 years ago, give or take a century, Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown despite centuries of searching, buried somewhere beneath the alluvial plain, its name surviving in the language that became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia for the next 2 millennia, Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that coexisted with Sumerian, gradually replacing it in daily speech, while Sumerian persisted as the language of scholarship and ritual. Like Latin in medieval Europe, the empire Sargon built required new technologies of administration, new ways of projecting power across distance, and so the apparatus of state grew more sophisticated. Royal inscriptions carved in stone proclaimed his victories, his justice, his divine mandate, and these inscriptions were written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, a political statement as much as a practical one, honoring the old while asserting the new. I imagine the armies marching, soldiers equipped with bows and spears and axes, organized into units, supplied by a logistics system that could move grain and water across hostile terrain, conquering cities that had never known foreign rule, installing governors loyal to Sargon, demanding tribute, and with conquest came trade, goods flowing along protected routes, merchants moving freely under the king's authority, wealth accumulating in Akkad and redistributed to maintain the military, the bureaucracy, the monumental building projects that proclaimed imperial glory. But empires are fragile, maintained by constant effort, and when Sargon died, his sons and grandsons struggled to hold what he had won. Rebellions flared in the Sumerian cities, resentful of Akkadian dominance, and it took ruthless suppression to maintain control. Entire cities destroyed as examples, populations deported, the inscription of Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin describing how he defeated a coalition of rebellious kings, how he claimed divinity for himself, wearing the horned crown previously reserved for gods, and having his image carved on victory steles showing him trampling enemies underfoot, ascending a mountain with the stars of the gods shining above. The Akkadian Empire lasted perhaps a century and a half, and its collapse was sudden, catastrophic, caused by a combination of internal rebellion and external invasion, raids by the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, and possibly, though this remains debated, by climate change, a severe drought that may have driven pastoral peoples from the surrounding steppes into the fertile river valley, creating a cascade of migrations and conflicts that the imperial structure could not withstand. In the chaos that followed, power devolved back to the city-states, but the idea of empire had been planted, the memory of unified rule under a single king, and after a period of fragmentation, the Sumerian cities experienced a renaissance, particularly which emerged as the dominant power around 4,100 years ago, establishing what scholars call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-3, a period of extraordinary cultural achievement and bureaucratic complexity. The kings of Ur-3 recreated many aspects of the Akkadian state, but with a Sumerian identity, a conscious revival of older traditions expressed in art and architecture and official language, the great ziggurat of Ur rising in tiers of baked brick, its corners oriented to the cardinal directions, its massive form visible for miles across the flat plain. An artificial mountain connecting earth to heaven, the dwelling place of Nana, the moon god, and around it the temple complex with its workshops and storerooms and administrative offices, the economic heart of the state. The bureaucracy of Ur-3 was astonishingly detailed. We have tens of thousands of clay tablets recording the minutiae of temple and state administration, receipts for livestock, ration distributions, work assignments, each transaction documented by scribes who spent years learning the complex cuneiform system, mastering not just the signs, but the formulaic language of administration, the proper way to record a delivery of wool or an assignment of laborers to canal maintenance. I see the archive rooms, shelves stacked with tablets, some still soft and needing to be dried, others already baked hard by time or accident. each one a tiny fragment of the vast informational apparatus that kept the state functioning, that tracked resources from production to consumption, that made it possible to feed and clothe thousands of workers, to plan agricultural cycles, to prepare for festivals, to maintain the infrastructure of canals and walls and roads. The legal system, too, became more codified, building on earlier traditions, establishing principles that would echo through later law codes, the presumption that crimes could be atoned through compensation rather than vengeance, that contracts must be witnessed and recorded, that even the powerful could be held accountable to written standards, though of course the reality often fell short of the ideal. Justice available more readily to those with resources and connections. Women in this society occupied complex positions. Elite women could own property, conduct business, serve as priestesses, some even ruled as regents. But the general trend over time was toward increasing restrictions, increasing emphasis on patriarchal control, marriage contracts that treated women as property to be exchanged, divorce laws that heavily favored men, and yet within these constraints, individual women found ways to exercise agency, to accumulate wealth, to influence the powerful men in their lives. The scribal schools, called eduba or tablet houses, trained boys from elite families in the arts of writing and calculation, an education that could take years, beginning with copying simple signs, progressing to syllabaries and word lists, mathematical tables and legal formulae, and finally to literature, the great works of Sumerian poetry and wisdom, students copying the same texts generation after generation, preserving them, and in the process creating a literary canon, a shared cultural heritage that transcended individual cities. Among the texts they copied were hymns, prayers addressed to various gods, praising their attributes, requesting their favor, and myths, stories of creation and cosmic battle, the tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, of Inanna's descent to the underworld, narratives that explained the nature of reality, the relationship between gods and humans, the inevitability of death, and the importance of leaving a name, a reputation, something that would survive the body's dissolution. The astronomical observations continued and deepened, priests tracking the movements of Venus with extraordinary precision, recognizing patterns, understanding that celestial events could be predicted, compiled in omens lists that correlated heavenly phenomena with earthly outcomes. If Venus appears in such and such position, the king will die, the harvest will fail, the enemy will attack. And while we might dismiss this as superstition, it represented a sophisticated understanding that the universe operated according to regular patterns, that observation and record-keeping could reveal those patterns, a proto-scientific impulse, even if the causal framework was religious. Mathematics, too, flourished, the Mesopotamians using a sexagesimal system, base 60, which gave them great flexibility in calculation, allowing them to express fractions easily, to solve complex problems of land measurement and volume, and this mathematical tradition would survive, passing to the Greeks and eventually to us in the 60 minutes of an hour, the 60 seconds of a minute. The 360 degrees of a circle, inheritances from Mesopotamian scribes working by lamplight in temple offices 4,000 years ago. But the Ur-3 state, despite its sophistication, despite its elaborate systems of control and documentation, also collapsed, weakened by the same pressures that had destroyed Akkad, incursions by Amorite peoples from the west, internal rebellions, possibly environmental stress, and around 4,000 years ago, the last king of Ur was carried off into captivity, his city destroyed, and in the lamentations composed afterward, we hear genuine grief, a city personified as a woman weeping for her lost children, the temples abandoned, the gods departed, everything that seemed permanent revealed as fragile. Yet even in collapse there was continuity. The Amorites who conquered the Sumerian cities adopted Mesopotamian culture, learned cuneiform, worshipped the old gods alongside their own, established new dynasties in the old cities, and among these Babylon began its rise, a city that had been relatively minor, but whose location on the Euphrates, at the nexus of trade routes, Yahshua gave it strategic importance, and under a series of capable rulers, it accumulated power, wealth, authority, preparing the ground for its greatest king. Hammurabi, ruling around 3,750 years ago, expanded Babylon's control methodically through diplomacy and warfare, conquering Muri and Larsa and Eshnunna, reunifying much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian authority, and while he was not the first to issue a law code, his is the most complete that survives, inscribed on a black stone stele, with the image of the king receiving authority from the sun, god Shamash. 282 laws covering everything from property rights to personal injury, from family relations to commercial transactions. The laws reveal a society stratified by class, different penalties for the same crime depending on whether the victim was a noble, a commoner, or a slave. The famous principle of an eye for an eye applying only within the same social tier, but they also show concern for the vulnerable, the widow and orphan, limits on the power of creditors, requirements that officials act justly or face severe penalties, an attempt, however imperfect, to create a predictable legal framework, to replace arbitrary power with written standards known to all. I imagine the stele standing in a public space, passers-by pausing to read, or more likely, to have read to them by a scribe, the laws that governed their lives, the protections they could claim, the obligations they must fulfill, and this publicness, this assertion that law should be visible and knowable, represents something profound, a check on tyranny, a foundation for social order based on more than force. Babylon under Hammurabi became a cultural center, its prestige attracting scholars and artists, its scribal schools preserving and creating literature, its temples serving as centers of learning, and the Babylonian dialect of Akkadian began to spread, becoming the language of diplomacy and scholarship throughout the Near East. Tablets from Egypt to Anatolia, written in Babylonian cuneiform, a testament to the soft power that accompanied military conquest. The city itself grew magnificent, though most of what we associate with Babylon, the Ishtar Gate, the Hanging Gardens, came much later. In Hammurabi's time, it was already substantial, surrounded by walls, divided by the Euphrates, temples rising above the mud brick houses, markets bustling with merchants from distant lands, workshops producing the finest textiles and metalwork, and at the center, the palace complex where the king administered justice. Received ambassadors, planned campaigns, maintained the delicate balance of power that held the empire together. The empire Hammurabi built did not long survive his death. Within a generation, Babylon's control over the south weakened, and new powers emerged in the shifting landscape of alliances and conquests, the Kassites descending from the Zagros Mountains to establish a dynasty that would rule Babylon for 4 centuries, the longest-lasting dynasty in Mesopotamian history. And in the north, the kingdom of Mitanni rose to prominence, followed by the resurgence of Assyria, a city-state that had existed in the shadow of greater powers but would eventually surpass them all. The Kassites were outsiders, like the Amorites before them, but they too became Babylonianized, adopting the language and religion and administrative practices of the land they conquered, maintaining the temples, supporting the scribal schools, adding their own gods to the pantheon while honoring the old ones, and under their rule, Babylon remained a center of learning, its libraries preserving the literary heritage, its astronomers refining their observations, its mathematicians solving increasingly complex problems. Trade networks expanded during this period, reaching unprecedented distances. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan appearing in Egyptian tombs, amber from the Baltic found in Mesopotamian graves, tin from Central Asia, essential for bronze production, traveling along routes that connected civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. And with trade came cultural exchange, ideas moving along the same paths as goods, influencing art and architecture and religious thought in ways both obvious and subtle. But it was in the north, in Assyria, that the most dramatic developments unfolded. The Assyrian state had existed since the 3rd millennium, centered on the city of Ashur on the Tigris, named for its patron god, a trading hub that grew wealthy from commerce and gradually accumulated military power. And by the 14th century, before the Common Era, Assyria was challenging its neighbors, conquering territory, establishing the patterns of expansion and administration that would characterize its later empire. The Assyrians were warriors, their kings boasting in inscriptions of campaigns and conquests, of cities besieged and captured, of tribute extracted and rebels punished, and they developed military innovations that gave them decisive advantages, iron weapons when others still used bronze, cavalry alongside chariots, siege engines capable of breaching the strongest walls, and a logistical system that could supply armies in the field for extended campaigns, projecting power across vast distances. I imagine the Assyrian army on the march, columns of soldiers in bronze and leather armor, archers and spearmen, chariots raising dust, siege towers disassembled and carried on wagons, and behind them administrators and scribes, ready to organize the conquered territories, to assess tribute, to deport populations deemed unreliable, replacing them with people from other regions, a deliberate policy of mixing populations to prevent rebellion, to break local identities and create dependence on the central authority. The reliefs from Assyrian palaces show this military culture in vivid detail. Carved stone panels depicting battles and hunts, sieges with soldiers climbing ladders, enemies impaled or beheaded, royal lion hunts where the king demonstrates his courage and strength. And these weren't merely decorative, they were propaganda, assertions of power meant to impress visitors, to intimidate vassals, to glorify the king as the chosen of the gods, the bringer of order to a chaotic world. But Assyria was more than military might. Its capital cities, first Ashur, then Nimrud, then Khorsabad, finally Nineveh, became centers of culture and learning, royal libraries collected tablets from throughout the empire, copies of ancient texts, contemporary scholarship, diplomatic correspondence. The great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, containing perhaps 30,000 tablets, the largest collection in the ancient world, preserving works that would otherwise have been lost, including the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Ashurbanipal himself, ruling in the 7th century before the Common Era, was unusual among Assyrian kings for his scholarly interests. He boasted of his ability to read ancient Sumerian and complex cuneiform, of his knowledge of mathematics and divination, and he actively collected texts, sending scribes throughout the empire to copy works for his library, creating a repository of knowledge that attempted to gather all the wisdom of Mesopotamia in one place. The empire reached its greatest extent under Ashurbanipal, stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the Iranian plateau, and the administrative machinery required to govern such territory was extraordinarily complex. Provinces ruled by governors reporting to the king, a network of roads with stations for royal messengers, an intelligence system that kept the court informed of events in distant regions, and elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced the king's authority. His role as the representative of Ashur, the god who commanded conquest, who demanded tribute and obedience, yet even at its height, the empire contained the seeds of its collapse. The constant warfare exhausted resources. The deportations created resentment. The bureaucracy became unwieldy. And when external pressures mounted, when new enemies appeared, the structure proved brittle, unable to adapt. And in the final decades of the 7th century before the Common Era, everything fell apart with shocking speed. The Medes from the Iranian plateau allied with the Babylonians, who had chafed under Assyrian domination for generations, and together they destroyed the Assyrian heartland. Nimrud fell, then Ashur. Finally Nineveh in 612 before the Common Era. The great city burned so thoroughly that its ruins would lay hidden for millennia, and with its fall, the Assyrian Empire vanished, its military might, its administrative sophistication, its cultural achievements, all consumed in the conflagration of revenge. But from the ashes, Babylon rose again, greater than before, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nabopolassar, and his son Nebuchadnezzar expanding to control much of what Assyria had held. And Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city of the ancient world, the double walls so thick that chariots could race atop them, the Ishtar Gate covered in blue-glazed bricks with images of lions and dragons and bulls, the ziggurat of Marduk rising in 7 tiers, perhaps the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, and possibly, though evidence is uncertain, the Hanging Gardens, terraced and irrigated, a green wonder in the desert heat. The Babylonians of this era were conscious inheritors of a long tradition. They collected ancient texts, restored old temples, traced their legitimacy back through centuries of history, and they developed astronomy to new heights, systematic observations over decades, mathematical models that could predict planetary positions and eclipses with remarkable accuracy. The beginnings of a true science, observation leading to hypothesis, leading to prediction, leading to refinement. I see the astronomers on the ziggurat, night after night, tracking stars across the sky, recording positions with patient precision, and in the temple libraries, Scholars compiling this data, looking for patterns, creating tables, understanding that the cosmos operated according to mathematical principles, that the apparent chaos of heavenly movements concealed deep regularities. And this knowledge had practical applications: agricultural, timing, festival scheduling, and political. The ability to predict eclipses gave priests and kings powerful tools for maintaining authority. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire was brief, barely a century, before a new power emerged. The Persians under Cyrus sweeping west from Iran, and in 539 before the Common Era, Babylon opened its gates without a fight, Cyrus entering peacefully, proclaiming himself liberator rather than conqueror, and Mesopotamia became a province, a satrapy of a larger empire, governed from distant capitals. Its independence ended, though its culture remained influential. Under Persian rule, then Macedonian after Alexander's conquest, then Seleucid Greek, then Parthian, the cities of Mesopotamia gradually declined. The irrigation systems deteriorated without central maintenance. The canals silted up. Salt accumulated in the soil from millennia of irrigation, reducing fertility, and populations drifted away to new centers of power, to Damascus and Alexandria and Antioch, the old cities contracting, some abandoned entirely. Cuneiform, which had recorded human thought for 3,000 years, was gradually replaced, first by Aramaic, written in alphabetic script, easier to learn, more flexible, then by Greek, and the last datable cuneiform tablet comes from the 1st century of the Common Era, an astronomical text, the final whisper of a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of writing, and, with its passing, the ability to read the accumulated wisdom of millennia was lost, the tablets becoming incomprehensible artifacts, dead voices waiting in darkness for someone to decipher their speech. The Mesopotamian gods lingered longer, worshipped in some places into the early centuries of the Common Era. But Christianity and other new religions displaced them. The great temples fell into ruin, their bricks carried away for other building projects, their ziggurats eroding back into shapeless mounds, and the very names of cities became confused. Later travelers unable to identify which tell was Babylon, which was Nineveh, the landscape of tells, artificial hills marking ancient settlements, stretching across the plain like burial mounds of a vanished world. And yet the influence persisted, invisible but pervasive, in the 7-day week inherited through Jewish tradition from Babylonian astronomy, in the division of the circle, in the mathematical techniques that passed through Greek and Arab scholars to medieval Europe, in the legal principles, in the literary motifs, the flood story, the tragic hero seeking immortality, the beloved descending to the underworld, in the very idea of the city, the state, the empire, patterns, first established between two rivers, the agricultural techniques, the administrative methods, the astronomical knowledge, the mathematical insights, all moved outward, influencing peoples who never knew their origin, becoming part of the common heritage of civilization, foundations so deeply buried that we forget they exist. Until archaeologists dig through layers of earth and find the tablets, brittle and brown, covered in wedge-shaped impressions, and scholars spend lifetimes learning to read them, recovering voices that speak of flood and drought, of love and loss, of the daily transactions of life, of humanity in its earliest experiments with complexity, with permanence, with the attempt to create something that would outlast individual lives, that would touch eternity. And so I return to the silence, to the mounds rising from the plain like gentle waves frozen in earth, and I think about what it means that this beginning, this first great experiment in complexity, happened here, in a place that offered no easy answers. No forests full of timber, no mountains rich with metal, no reliable rainfall, only 2 rivers and the silt they carried and the challenge of making life possible in between. The innovation was born of necessity, irrigation because without it nothing would grow, writing because the systems became too complex to hold in memory, law because density created friction, conflict, the need for agreed-upon rules, and cities because collective effort could achieve what individuals could not, could move the earth, redirect the water, build monuments that scrape the sky. But there was more than necessity. There was also wonder, the impulse to look at the stars and see not chaos, but pattern, to ask where the world came from, why humans die, while gods do not, what makes a life worth living. And the answers they found, preserved in epic and hymn and wisdom literature, still resonate, still speak to questions we continue to ask. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that ancient poem, 2/3 God and 1/3 human, the king who has everything except the one thing he truly wants, immortality, friendship, meaning, and his journey takes him to the ends of the earth, through darkness, across deadly waters, to find the one man who survived the flood, who was granted eternal life. And the lesson he learns is not what he sought. He learns that death is inevitable, that the quest for immortality is futile, but that a well-built wall, a good name, acts of kindness and courage, these can outlast the body. There is something profoundly modern in this ancient wisdom, the acceptance of limitation, the focus on legacy rather than literal survival. And Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and shows his companion the walls he built, the city he made great, and finds in that a kind of peace, a resolution to the terror of mortality. Or consider the wisdom literature, the Akkadian dialogue between a master and his slave, where every proposed action is first endorsed, then contradicted. Should I go to the palace? Yes, master, for the king will honor you. No, master, for the king will destroy you. Should I love a woman? Yes, master, for love is sweet. No, master, for women are faithless. And on, until the slave suggests the only solution is death for both of them. And the master asks if the slave will die first, and the slave responds that no. The master cannot live even 3 days without him. A dark comedy about the impossibility of wisdom, the contradictory nature of existence, performed 4,000 years ago and still cutting, still true. The religious thought, too, shows remarkable sophistication. The gods are not omnibenevolent, not all-powerful. They have limitations, make mistakes, feel regret. They created humans to serve them, to grow food and maintain temples, to relieve the gods of labor, and this relationship is transactional, sacrifices for blessings, prayers for protection, but it can fail. The gods can be capricious, unjust, and this generates a literature of complaint. The righteous sufferer, questioning why the gods allow the innocent to suffer while the wicked prosper, the Odyssey in its earliest form. Wrestling with the problem of divine justice millennia before Job, I think about the continuity of human concerns, how the scribes of Mesopotamia worried about education, about children who would rather play than study. We have their school texts, the dialogue between teacher and student, the father scolding his son for laziness, the complaints about how hard the curriculum is, how strict the masters are, and across 4,000 years, the essential experience is unchanged, recognizable, almost funny in its familiarity, or the love poetry, the sacred marriage texts between Inanna and Dumuzi, erotic and tender, celebrating physical desire, the goddess praising her lover's beauty, his strength, their union ensuring fertility for the land, the crops, the herds, and alongside the sacred texts, profane ones, tavern songs, body humor, evidence of a full emotional and sensual life, not just the monumental cue and the official, but the intimate, the playful, the human. The mathematical achievements deserve pause. The Mesopotamians understood the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They could solve quadratic equations, calculate compound interest, determine the volume of irregular shapes, and they did this with a number system that used position notation, understanding that the same symbol could represent different values depending on where it appeared, a conceptual leap that made complex calculation possible. And their mathematical tables, their problem sets for students, show a pedagogical tradition, knowledge systematically transmitted, refined, expanded across generations, the astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, revealing patterns invisible to a single lifetime of watching. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, recording the planet's appearances and disappearances over 21 years, recognizing the cycle, using it to predict, and this patient observation, this commitment to record keeping, to building knowledge incrementally, represents a profound faith in the future, in the value of knowing, even when the knowledge has no immediate practical application. And the art, the standard of Ur with its panels showing war and peace, banquet and battle, the delicate shell and lapis inlay, showing such attention to detail, such skill, or the golden bull's head from the great lyre, fierce and beautiful, decorated with scenes of animals acting as humans, a lion carrying food, a donkey playing a harp, humor and craft combined, or the portrait heads, the gypsum eyes inlaid with shell and lapis, staring across millennia with an intensity that feels almost alive, almost aware. These weren't primitive people stumbling towards civilization. They were fully human, fully conscious, as intelligent as we are, working with the materials and knowledge available to them, solving problems, creating beauty, asking questions that had no easy answers, and succeeding, creating a culture rich enough, complex enough to sustain itself for 3,000 years. 3,000 years, let that settle. The span from the first Sumerian cities to the last cuneiform tablet is longer than from the fall of Rome to now, longer than the history of any modern nation. And during that immense stretch, empires rose and fell, languages changed, populations mixed, but the fundamental patterns persisted. The ziggurat at the city center, the scribal schools preserving knowledge, the legal codes regulating behavior, the astronomical observations tracking celestial time until it ended, not in catastrophe exactly, but in slow dissolution, the center of gravity shifting west to the Mediterranean, to Greece and Rome, and the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia its libraries and archives became inaccessible, waiting in buried cities, in collapsed archives, for the archaeologists who would begin excavating in the 19th century, who would slowly, painstakingly learn to read cuneiform again, to piece together the shattered tablets, to reconstruct the voices of the dead, and now those voices speak again in museums and libraries, in scholarly editions and translations, the oldest literature, the oldest laws, the oldest cities, all emerging from the earth between two rivers, from the land that is now Iraq, still troubled, still marked by conflict, but holding in its soil the evidence of humanity's first great civilizations, the foundation upon which so much was built. I stand again at the edge of the idea, but now it has dimension, depth, faces and voices, not just abstractions, but individual scribes signing their names to tablets, kings boasting of conquests, lovers exchanging glances in poems, teachers scolding students, astronomers tracking Venus, mathematicians solving equations, all of them dead so long their bones are dust. But their words remain, pressed into clay, waiting to be read, to connect us to them, to remind us that we are part of something larger, older than we usually remember. The rivers still flow, the Tigris and Euphrates, though dams have changed their course. Pollution has dimmed their waters, but they flow, and the land between them still holds secrets, tells that have not been excavated, tablets that have not been read, whole cities perhaps still buried, waiting, and the influence ripples outward, invisible but real, in every city we build, every law we write, every story we tell, every calculation we make, every star we name. We are the inheritors of Mesopotamia, whether we know it or not, carrying forward patterns first established when the world was young, when writing was new, when the very idea of civilization was still being invented, still being tested, still being passed from one generation to the next, like a flame in darkness, fragile but enduring, bright enough to read by, warm enough to gather around, essential to everything that came after. The night deepens and the stars turn overhead, the same stars the Babylonian astronomers watched, the same patterns, eternal and indifferent, and beneath them the earth holds its memories, silent, patient, waiting for anyone curious enough to dig, to listen, to hear what the ancient voices have to say about being human, about building, about trying to make something permanent in a world of flood and drought, of conquest and collapse, of death that comes for everyone, king and scribe and slave alike, but also about the things that survive. The words pressed into clay, the ideas passed from mind to mind, the long conversation across time, which continues, which includes us now, as we too speak into the future, hoping someone will listen, will remember, will carry forward what we learned, what we built, what we dreamed in our brief time between the rivers of birth and death. There is a place where light bends differently, where the sun's rays stretch and soften as they pass through a shifting ceiling of water, and where silence takes on weight and texture, becoming something you can almost feel against your skin. This is the ocean, the vast body of water that covers more than 70% of our planet's surface. And within its depths exists an entire world, a realm of currents and canyons, of pressure and perpetual motion, of creatures that have never seen daylight, and landscapes more dramatic than any found on land. The study of this immense underwater universe is called oceanography, a discipline that spans biology and chemistry, physics and geology, all woven together in an attempt to understand the forces that shape our blue planet. Imagine standing at the edge of the sea, where the continent ends and the water begins. The waves roll in with their steady rhythm, pulling sand and shells back with each retreat, leaving foam that dissolves into nothing. The surface appears smooth from a distance, but up close it is textured with tiny ripples, catching fragments of light that dance and disappear. Beneath that surface, just beyond what the eye can see, the ocean floor begins its long descent. Starting in the shallows where sunlight still penetrates, the seafloor slopes gradually at first, covered in sand that shifts with the tides, dotted with rocks worn smooth by centuries of water moving across them. This shallow zone, known as the continental shelf, extends outward from the shore, sometimes for just a few miles, sometimes for hundreds. The water here is relatively warm, filled with particles of organic matter that drift like snow in slow motion, and through this zone, light filters down in shafts, illuminating clouds of plankton, tiny organisms that form the foundation of the ocean's food web. But the shelf does not go on forever. Eventually, the gentle slope gives way to something far more dramatic, a precipice where the ocean floor drops away into darkness. This is the continental slope, a massive underwater cliff that descends thousands of feet, carving the true edge between the shallow coastal waters and the deep ocean beyond. Down this slope, the light begins to fade. First, the reds disappear from the spectrum, absorbed by the water, then the oranges and yellows, until only blues and greens remain. And then, deeper still, even those colors vanish, leaving only blackness, a darkness more complete than any night sky. The pressure increases with every increment of depth. At the surface, the atmosphere presses down with a weight we never notice. But in the ocean, water adds its own mass, building and compounding, so that at just 30 feet down, the pressure has nearly doubled, and at 300 feet, it is 10 times greater than at the surface. Yet the ocean does not end at the base of the continental slope. Beyond that steep descent lies the abyssal plain, vast stretches of sea floor that extend for thousands of miles, flat and featureless in some places, interrupted by underwater mountains and volcanic ridges in others. These plains sit 2 to 3 miles beneath the surface, shrouded in perpetual darkness, subject to pressures that would crush most surface-dwelling creatures instantly. And even the abyssal plains are not the deepest points. Scattered across the ocean floor are trenches, narrow canyons that plunge even farther down, reaching depths of 6, 7, even nearly 7 miles below the surface, places where the ocean's weight becomes almost incomprehensible, where the pressure exceeds 8 tons per square inch. The ocean is not still. Even in its deepest regions, water moves, driven by forces both visible and invisible. At the surface, winds push waves across thousands of miles, transferring energy from the atmosphere into the sea. These waves can build to tremendous heights during storms, their crests breaking into white foam, their troughs becoming valleys of darker water. But beneath the surface drama, other movements shape the ocean's character. Great rivers of water flow through the depths, currents that circle entire ocean basins, carrying heat from the equator toward the poles and cold water back toward the tropics. These currents move slowly compared to surface waves, but their volume is staggering, transporting more water in a single stream than all the rivers on land combined. The ocean also moves vertically. Cold, dense water sinks in the polar regions, beginning a journey that will take it along the ocean floor, across entire hemispheres, before it eventually rises again centuries later, warmed and transformed. This circulation, sometimes called the ocean's conveyor belt, connects all the world's seas, ensuring that even the most remote corners of the ocean are part of a single living system. To understand the ocean is to understand the planet itself, because the sea and the land and the atmosphere are not separate entities, but parts of an interconnected whole. The ocean absorbs heat from the sun, moderating temperatures across the globe. It releases moisture into the air, creating the clouds that bring rain to the continents. It absorbs carbon dioxide, playing a crucial role in regulating the atmosphere's composition. For most of human history, the ocean remained a mystery, a boundary that marked the edge of the known world. Ancient peoples lived along coastlines, fished in shallow waters, and watched the tides rise and fall with the moon. But the deep sea beyond the horizon was unreachable, unknowable, a realm of speculation and myth. The earliest attempts to understand the ocean were practical rather than scientific. Fishermen learned to read the color of the water, the behavior of birds, the direction of winds. They developed an intimate knowledge of local currents and seasonal patterns, passing this wisdom down through generations, but their understanding extended only as far as their boats could carry them, and their lines could reach. The ancient Greeks and Romans ventured farther, building ships that could cross the Mediterranean and eventually sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. They noticed that the sea had different characteristics in different places, that some waters were warmer or saltier than others, that certain areas teemed with life while others seemed barren. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, attempted to explain the ocean's saltiness. He proposed that seawater was a mixture of fresh water and some kind of earthy substance, a theory that would persist for centuries, though it was far from correct. He also wrote about marine life, describing the creatures found in coastal waters, noting their behaviors and characteristics with careful attention. But these early observers had no way to explore beneath the surface, no means of measuring depth beyond dropping weighted lines, no instruments to sample the water at different levels. The ocean remained largely opaque, its interior hidden from human eyes. The age of ocean exploration began not with science, but with navigation. As European powers began to venture across the Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries, sailors needed better maps, more accurate knowledge of winds and currents. The ocean was no longer just a resource to be harvested, but a highway to be mastered. Captains kept logs, recording their positions, the direction and strength of winds, the temperature of the air and water. Over time, these observations accumulated, revealing patterns. Sailors learned that certain winds blew reliably in certain latitudes, that currents flowed in predictable directions, that the ocean had a structure, even if that structure was not yet understood. In 1686, a man named Edmund Halley, better known for the comet that bears his name, designed a diving bell, a weighted chamber that could be lowered beneath the surface with men inside, supplied with air pumped down from the surface through leather hoses. Halley himself descended to depths of nearly 60 feet, remaining submerged for extended periods, observing the underwater world through small windows. It was a crude device, limited in depth and duration, but it represented something new, the first systematic attempt to witness the ocean environment directly, rather than simply imagining it from above. The 18th century brought new instruments. The thermometer, refined and standardized, allowed scientists to measure water temperature at different depths, revealing that the ocean was not uniformly warm or cold, but layered, with temperature boundaries that separated different masses of water. Investigators began to collect samples from depth, using bottles that could be sealed underwater and brought back to the surface. These samples revealed differences in salinity, in clarity, in the microscopic life suspended in the water. The ocean, it became clear, was not a homogeneous mass, but a complex environment with distinct characteristics at different depths and in different regions. In 1839, a British naval officer named James Clark Ross embarked on an expedition to the Antarctic. His mission was primarily magnetic research, mapping the Earth's magnetic field in the southern hemisphere, but Ross was also curious about the ocean itself. He carried with him more than 5 miles of rope, hoping to sound the depths in the open sea. On the 3rd of January, 1840, in the southern Atlantic, Ross's crew began lowering a weighted line. They fed out rope for hours, watching it descend into the blue-black water. Finally, at 2,425 fathoms, nearly 15,000 feet, the weight struck bottom. It was one of the first reliable measurements of the deep ocean floor, proof that the sea was far deeper than anyone had previously confirmed. But reaching the bottom with a rope was just the beginning. Scientists wanted to know what was down there, whether life existed at such depths, what the seafloor was made of, what the water itself contained. In 1872, a British ship called the Challenger set sail from Portsmouth, beginning what would become the first true oceanographic expedition. The voyage would last 3.5 years, covering nearly 70,000 nautical miles and touching every ocean except the Arctic. The Challenger was a naval corvette, modified for scientific research. Her gun deck was converted into laboratories. Her hull carried hundreds of miles of rope, dozens of thermometers, water sampling bottles, dredges and nets for collecting specimens. The scientific staff included naturalists, chemists, and artists who would document everything they found. The expedition's leader, a Scottish naturalist named Charles Wyville Thomson, had a specific question he wanted to answer. At the time, many scientists believed in something called the azoic theory, the idea that below a certain depth, the ocean was devoid of life. The pressure was too great, the cold too intense, the darkness too complete. Nothing, they argued, could survive in such conditions. Thomson suspected otherwise. Previous dredging operations in shallower waters had found life at surprising depths, and he believed that with the right equipment, life would be discovered even in the deepest trenches. The Challenger's crew developed a routine. At designated stations, they would stop the ship and begin their measurements. First, they would take soundings dropping weighted lines to determine the depth. Then they would lower thermometers, specially designed devices that could record the temperature at specific depths and retain that information as they were hauled back to the surface. Next came water samples, bottles that could be triggered to close at predetermined depths, capturing water from the surface, from intermediate levels, and from just above the seafloor. These samples would be analyzed for salinity, for dissolved gases, for the microscopic organisms drifting within them. Finally, they would deploy the dredges and trawls, heavy metal frames fitted with nets, dragged along the ocean floor to collect whatever lay there. Sometimes the nets came up empty, torn by rocks or lost in the darkness, but often they returned filled with mud and clay, with shells and stones, and with creatures no human had ever seen. The Challenger crossed the Atlantic, stopped at island chains in the mid-ocean, then sailed south around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. At each station, the same methodical process, lowering, waiting, hauling up, recording. The work was tedious and dangerous. Men were sometimes lost when ropes snapped. Equipment was constantly damaged or destroyed by the forces of the deep sea. But the data accumulated. Slowly, a picture emerged. The ocean floor was not flat and featureless, but varied dramatically. In some places, the bottom was close to the surface, forming underwater plateaus and ridges. In others, it dropped away into profound depths, canyons that dwarfed anything on land. The temperature measurements revealed a layered structure, warm water at the surface, cooled by the atmosphere in polar regions, then sinking and spreading along the bottom. Cold currents flowing from the poles toward the equator, while warmer surface currents moved in the opposite direction. And life was everywhere. Even at depths of 3 miles or more, the dredges brought up living creatures, delicate glass sponges, translucent worms, fish with enormous eyes adapted to detect the faintest glimmers of light, starfish and sea cucumbers crawling across the muddy bottom, feeding on organic debris that drifted down from above. The azoic theory was shattered. The deep ocean was not a sterile void, but a vast habitat, teeming with organisms that had evolved to thrive under conditions that seemed utterly hostile to life. The Challenger returned to England in 1876. Her holds were filled with specimens. Her logs contained thousands of observations. The analysis of this data would take decades, ultimately filling 50 thick volumes, a comprehensive survey that transformed oceanography from a collection of scattered observations into a coherent scientific discipline. Other expeditions followed. The German ship Gazelle circumnavigated the globe between 1874 and 1876, focusing on the Atlantic and Pacific. The French mounted multiple expeditions aboard vessels like the Travailleur and Talisman. Exploring the Mediterranean and the eastern Atlantic, each voyage added to the growing body of knowledge, more depth measurements, more temperature profiles, more samples of water and sediment and life. Maps of the ocean floor began to take shape, still crude and incomplete, but showing features that had never been suspected: vast underwater mountain ranges, deep trenches, expansive plains. Scientists began to understand the ocean's role in shaping climate. The currents that had long been known to sailors were now recognized as critical elements of a global system, moving heat from the tropics to the poles, moderating temperatures across entire continents. The Gulf Stream, for instance, carried warm water from the Caribbean northward along the coast of North America, then eastward across the Atlantic, bringing mild temperatures to Western Europe that would otherwise be far colder at such latitudes. The chemical composition of seawater became clearer, not just salt, but a complex mixture of dissolved minerals, sodium and chloride in the greatest abundance, but also magnesium, sulfate, calcium, potassium, and dozens of trace elements. The salinity varied from place to place, higher in regions where evaporation exceeded precipitation, lower near river mouths where fresh water poured into the sea. Scientists also discovered that the ocean was not uniformly mixed, but stratified into distinct layers, each with its own characteristics. Near the surface, warmed by the sun and churned by wind and waves, lay a zone of relatively uniform temperature. This mixed layer extended down anywhere from 50 to several hundred feet, depending on the season and location. Below the mixed layer, temperature dropped rapidly. This zone, called the thermocline, marked a sharp boundary. In tropical waters, you could descend through comfortable warmth and then, within just a few dozen feet, enter water that was startlingly cold. The thermocline acted as a barrier, preventing deeper water from mixing with the surface, creating separate realms within the same ocean. Beneath the thermocline lay the deep water, cold and dark, its temperature hovering just a few degrees above freezing. This water moved slowly, circulating through the ocean basins on timescales of centuries, carrying with it the chemical signature of the polar regions where it had last touched the atmosphere. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought new technologies. In 1877, a scientist named Alexander Agassiz, son of the famous naturalist Louis Agassiz, began using steel cable instead of hemp rope for deep-sea work. Steel was stronger, more reliable, less likely to snap under the tremendous strain of hauling dredges from the abyss. It also allowed for more precise depth measurements. New sampling devices appeared. The Nansen bottle, invented by Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen in 1894, could be sent down on a wire and triggered to close at a specific depth, capturing water without contamination from other layers. Multiple bottles could be attached to a single wire, allowing scientists to sample many different depths on a single lowering. Photography began to reveal the ocean's secrets. In 1893, Louis Boutin, a French biologist, took the first underwater photographs in shallow water near the Mediterranean coast. His images were murky and indistinct, but they showed a world that had previously been accessible only to divers or to artists attempting to sketch what they saw in fleeting glimpses. The early 20th century saw the development of echo sounding, a technique that used sound waves instead of weighted lines to measure depth. A ship would emit a sharp sound, then listen for the echo bouncing back from the seafloor. By measuring the time between the original sound and its return, and knowing the speed of sound in water, the depth could be calculated. Early echo sounders were crude, requiring an operator to listen through headphones for the faint return signal, distinguishing it from the ship's engine noise and the general cacophony of the sea. But they were far faster than lowering ropes, allowing ships to take continuous depth measurements as they moved, building up detailed profiles of the seafloor. In 1925, the German research vessel Meteor began a 2-year expedition across the Atlantic using echo-sounding technology. The meteor made more than 67,000 depth measurements, crisscrossing the ocean in a systematic grid. The resulting maps revealed the mid-Atlantic ridge in unprecedented detail, a massive underwater mountain range running the length of the Atlantic, rising thousands of feet above the surrounding sea floor. In some places, the ridge's peaks broke the surface as islands, the Azores, Iceland, Ascension, lonely outposts in the vast ocean. The discovery raised questions. Why was there a mountain range in the middle of the ocean? Why did it run in such a precise line, roughly parallel to the coastlines of Africa and South America? Some scientists noted that the continents seemed to fit together like puzzle pieces, that the ridge lay almost exactly between them. But the idea that continents could move was considered radical, unthinkable to most geologists of the time. Meanwhile, biologists were uncovering the complexity of ocean life. The surface waters, they learned, were far more productive than the depths. Here, sunlight penetrated, allowing microscopic plants called phytoplankton to photosynthesize. These tiny organisms, some no larger than bacteria, drifted by the billions in every gallon of seawater, forming vast invisible meadows, converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into organic matter. The phytoplankton were eaten by zooplankton, tiny animals that range from single-celled organisms to the larvae of fish and crustaceans. The zooplankton were in turn consumed by small fish, which were eaten by larger fish, and so on up the food chain. But this simple description masked incredible diversity. Each layer of the ocean had its own community of organisms, adapted to specific conditions of light, temperature, and pressure. Some creatures undertook daily migrations, rising toward the surface at night to feed, then descending to deeper, darker waters during the day. This vertical movement, involving billions of individual animals, represented one of the largest migrations on Earth, though it occurred entirely out of human sight. Scientists began to appreciate the ocean's role in the global carbon cycle. Phytoplankton, like land plants, absorbed carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. When these organisms died, some sank into the deep ocean, carrying carbon with them. This biological pump, as it came to be called, removed carbon from the atmosphere and sequestered it in the depths. Sometimes for thousands of years, the ocean also exchanged gases with the atmosphere at the surface, absorbing oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide. The rate of this exchange depended on temperature, on the roughness of the sea, on the chemical composition of the water. Cold water could hold more dissolved gas than warm water, so the polar oceans absorbed more carbon dioxide and oxygen than tropical seas. By the 1930s, oceanography had become an established science with dedicated research institutions. Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, institutes in Europe and Japan, all focused on understanding the sea. These institutions built specialized research vessels equipped with laboratories and the latest instruments, and sent them on expeditions that lasted months or years. The Second World War brought new urgency to ocean research. Navies needed to understand how sound traveled underwater for detecting submarines. They needed to know about currents and tides for planning amphibious assaults. They needed maps of the seafloor to navigate safely in unknown waters. This military interest led to rapid advances in technology, better sonar systems, more sensitive hydrophones for listening to underwater sounds, improved diving equipment. After the war, many of these technologies found civilian applications, accelerating the pace of oceanographic discovery. In 1943, Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon invented the aqualung, a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus that allowed divers to swim freely underwater without being tethered to the surface. For the first time, humans could move through the ocean, could observe marine life in its natural habitat without the constraints of heavy diving helmets and airlines. Cousteau's films and books brought the underwater world to millions. His descriptions of diving on coral reefs, exploring shipwrecks, swimming alongside dolphins and sharks, captivated public imagination. The ocean was no longer an abstract scientific subject, but a place of beauty and wonder, accessible to anyone willing to learn to dive. But the deep ocean, the abyss below the reach of the divers, remained largely unexplored. The pressure at even moderate depths was crushing. At 1,000 feet, it exceeded 400 pounds per square inch, far beyond what human flesh could withstand. Only specially designed vessels could venture into these depths. In 1930, William Beebe and Otis Barton descended to 1,426 feet off Bermuda in a device called the bathysphere, a steel sphere with thick quartz windows suspended from a ship by a cable. Beebe described seeing fish that glowed with their own light, bioluminescent creatures that had evolved to produce light in the eternal darkness. He saw jellyfish trailing luminous tentacles, shrimp that expelled clouds of glowing particles when disturbed. The bathysphere could only go where its cable allowed, and it was entirely dependent on the surface ship. If the cable broke, the sphere would sink to the bottom, its occupants trapped inside. But despite the dangers, Beebe and Barton made multiple descents, reaching 3,028 feet in 1934, a record that would stand for 15 years. The next breakthrough came from a Swiss physicist named Auguste Piccard, who had previously designed high-altitude balloons. Piccard realized that the same principles could work in reverse. A vessel filled with gasoline, which was less dense than water and incompressible, could provide buoyancy, while a heavy ballast could be dropped to ascend. This design, called a bathyscaphe, would be independent of surface support, able to dive and return under its own control. In 1953, Piccard and his son Jacques descended to 10,335 feet off the coast of Italy in their bathyscaphe Trieste, proving the concept 7 years later on January 23, 1960. Jacques Piccard and U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh piloted the Trieste to the deepest point in the ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench. They descended for nearly 5 hours, watching the darkness deepen, feeling the temperature drop. The pressure gauge climbed steadily. At 35,813 feet, they touched bottom. The pressure outside the sphere exceeded 16,000 pounds per square inch, enough to compress the vessel's steel sphere by a fraction of an inch. And there, in the deepest place on Earth, they saw life, a flatfish, about a foot long, lying on the sediment, and a shrimp-like creature swimming past their window. It was confirmation, if any was still needed, that life had colonized every part of the ocean, from sun-drenched tropical shallows to the crushing darkness of the deepest trenches. The Trieste dive marked a turning point. Humans had reached the ocean's greatest depth, but the technology required was expensive and complex. The bathyscaphe could carry only 2 people, could stay down for a limited time, and could explore only a tiny area around its landing site. What oceanographers needed were tools that could map and sample the seafloor systematically, covering vast distances, operating for extended periods. The 1960s and 70s brought a revolution in ocean floor mapping. Ships began towing magnetometers, instruments that measured the magnetic properties of the rocks beneath the sea floor. These surveys revealed something unexpected. The rocks on either side of the mid-ocean ridges showed a striped pattern, alternating bands of normal and reversed magnetic polarity, extending away from the ridge in mirror image symmetry. The explanation, when it came, was transformative. The Earth's magnetic field had reversed many times throughout history, flipping north and south. When molten rock erupted at the mid-ocean ridges, it cooled and solidified, locking in the magnetic orientation of that moment. As new rock continued to form at the ridge, older rock was pushed aside, creating a spreading sea floor that recorded the history of magnetic reversals. This discovery confirmed what had once seemed impossible. The ocean floor was not static, but constantly being created at the ridges and destroyed at the deep trenches where it plunged beneath continental plates. The continents were not fixed, but drifting, carried along by the slow convection of rock in the Earth's mantle. Oceanography had revealed the mechanism that drove plate tectonics, fundamentally changing our understanding of how the planet works. Deep-sea drilling projects began in 1968, when the research vessel Glomar Challenger began taking core samples from the ocean floor. The ship could drill in water thousands of feet deep, extracting cylindrical cores of sediment and rock that recorded millions of years of history. Each layer in these cores represented a different time period, containing fossils of ancient organisms, chemical signatures of past climates, evidence of volcanic eruptions and impacts from space. The cores revealed that the ocean floor was young compared to the continents. No seafloor rocks older than about 200 million years could be found, while continental rocks dated back billions of years. This made sense in light of seafloor spreading. The ocean floor was constantly recycling, disappearing into trenches and being replaced by new rock at the ridges. Meanwhile, new vehicles were being designed for deep-sea exploration. In 1964, the research submersible Alvin was launched. Unlike the bathyscaphe, Alvin was maneuverable, equipped with thrusters that allowed it to move horizontally, to hover, to approach objects with precision. It could carry 3 people, a pilot, and 2 observers, and stay submerged for hours. Alvin's first major discovery came in 1977 while investigating the Galapagos Rift, a volcanically active zone where tectonic plates were spreading apart. Scientists aboard the submersible found something entirely unexpected. In the cold, dark water, 2 miles beneath the surface, they discovered hot springs, vents where superheated water, rich in dissolved minerals, poured out of cracks in the seafloor. Around these vents clustered communities of life unlike anything seen before: giant tube worms, 8 feet long, with blood-red plumes waving in the current, ghostly white crabs and blind shrimp, clams and mussels growing to remarkable sizes, all thriving in water that would be instantly lethal to most organisms, water laden with hydrogen sulfide and heavy metals, water utterly devoid of oxygen. The explanation took time to piece together. These organisms were not relying on photosynthesis, as all known ecosystems did, either directly or indirectly. Instead, they depended on chemosynthesis. Bacteria living in the tissues of the tube, worms and clams were converting the chemicals in the vent water into organic matter, using the energy released by chemical reactions rather than sunlight. This discovery had profound implications. It meant that life did not necessarily require sunlight, that entire ecosystems could exist in complete darkness, powered by the Earth's internal heat. It suggested that similar communities might exist on other worlds, in the dark oceans beneath the ice of Jupiter's moon Europa, or in the subsurface seas of Saturn's moon Enceladus. More hydrothermal vents were discovered in the years that followed. Each vent field had its own distinct community. Different species adapted to slightly different temperatures, different chemical compositions. Some vents produced black smokers, chimneys of mineral deposits that spewed dark plumes of superheated water. Others released clear, shimmering fluid, creating underwater hot springs. The late 20th century also brought advances in remote sensing. Satellites equipped with radar altimeters could measure the height of the ocean's surface with remarkable precision. Slight bulges in the surface, just inches high, corresponded to underwater mountains, where the extra mass pulled the water slightly upward through gravity. Similarly, trenches created subtle depressions. By mapping these surface variations from space, scientists could infer the shape of the seafloor, even in areas that had never been surveyed by ships. Autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, began to appear in the 1980s and 90s. These robot submarines could be programmed to follow predetermined paths, mapping the seafloor with sonar, taking water samples, photographing marine life, all without human pilots. They could venture into spaces too small or dangerous for crewed submersibles, could stay submerged for days or weeks, covering hundreds of miles. Ocean science became increasingly international and collaborative. Research vessels from dozens of nations worked together on global projects, mapping currents, studying climate patterns, monitoring the health of marine ecosystems. Data was shared openly, allowing scientists anywhere in the world to analyze observations from distant oceans. The ocean's role in climate became clearer through this collaborative work. Scientists traced how heat absorbed at the surface in the tropics was transported toward the poles by currents. They measured how carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolved into seawater, making the ocean slightly more acidic. They discovered that the ocean contained more than 50 times as much carbon as the atmosphere, acting as a vast reservoir that buffered changes in atmospheric composition. But this buffering had limits. As carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere rose, the ocean absorbed more of it. The increasing acidity began to affect organisms that built shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate. Corals grew more slowly, their structures becoming more fragile. Pteropods, tiny swimming snails that formed a crucial part of the food chain, found it harder to maintain their delicate shells. Long-term monitoring programs revealed changes in the ocean itself. Surface temperatures were rising. Warm water species were appearing in regions they had never inhabited before. Cold water species were retreating toward the poles. Ice was melting in the Arctic, opening passages that had been frozen for thousands of years. The ocean was responding to a warming world, absorbing heat, expanding slightly as it warmed, contributing to rising sea levels. Scientists deployed arrays of floating sensors across all the major ocean basins. These sensors, called Argo floats, drifted with the currents, periodically diving to depths of 6,000 feet, measuring temperature and salinity as they descended, then surfacing to transmit their data via satellite. With thousands of these floats scattered across the oceans, scientists could track changes in real time, building a three-dimensional picture of ocean conditions updated continuously. Deep sea biology continued to reveal surprises. Cameras lowered to the abyssal plains captured images of fish with enormous jaws, able to swallow prey larger than themselves, octopuses brooding their eggs for years in the cold darkness, moving barely at all, conserving energy in an environment where food was scarce, amphipods the size of dinner plates, scavenging the remains of dead animals that drifted down from the surface. Researchers studying the twilight zone, the layer between 600 and 3,000 feet, found that it contained more fish than all the world's fisheries combined. Schools of lanternfish and bristlemouths, each fish no longer than a finger, but numbering in the billions. Their collective mass was staggering, yet they remained almost entirely unharvested, living in a zone too deep for most fishing gear, too dispersed to be economically viable. The ocean floor itself became a subject of intense interest, not just for science, but for resources. Vast fields of manganese nodules carpeted parts of the abyssal plains, potato-sized lumps of metal-rich minerals that had formed over millions of years. Hydrothermal vents deposited copper, zinc, gold, and other valuable metals. Companies began to discuss mining these deposits, raising questions about how to extract resources without destroying unique ecosystems. By the early 21st century, oceanography had become a highly technical field, combining physics, chemistry, biology, and geology with advanced engineering and computer modeling. Supercomputers ran simulations of ocean circulation, predicting how currents would respond to changing atmospheric conditions, how heat would distribute through the water column, how ecosystems might shift in response to warming and acidification. Yet for all the progress, vast areas remained unexplored. More than 80% of the ocean floor had never been mapped at high resolution. Countless species remained undiscovered. Entire ecosystems likely existed in places no human had ever visited. The ocean, despite centuries of study, remained largely unknown, a frontier as vast and mysterious as space, but far closer, just beneath the shimmering surface. The ocean is always moving, even when its surface appears calm. Within its depths, currents flow in patterns that span the globe, connecting distant shores, carrying warmth and cold, nutrients and sediments across thousands of miles. These movements are driven by forces both visible and invisible, by winds that push water across the surface, by differences in temperature and salinity that create density gradients, by the rotation of the Earth itself. Near the equator, trade winds blow steadily from east to west, pushing surface water before them. This water piles up against the western boundaries of ocean basins, creating pressure that drives currents northward and southward along the edges of continents. The Gulf Stream flows along the eastern coast of North America, carrying more than 100 times the volume of all the world's rivers combined. Its water is warm, tropical, a vivid blue that contrasts sharply with the gray-green coastal waters it passes. As the Gulf Stream moves northward, it begins to meander, forming great loops and eddies that spin off from the main current. These rings of water, some warm and some cold, can persist for months, drifting slowly across the ocean like liquid weather systems. Marine life congregates at their edges, where different water masses meet, creating zones of unusual productivity. Eventually, the warm current cools, losing heat to the atmosphere, becoming denser in the far North Atlantic. Near Greenland and Iceland, the water becomes cold and salty enough to sink, beginning a journey that will take it along the ocean floor, across the equator, around Antarctica, and into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. This deep water will not return to the surface for perhaps 1,000 years, carrying with it the chemical signature of the atmosphere as it was at the moment of sinking. The ocean breathes with the seasons. In spring, as sunlight strengthens and days lengthen, phytoplankton bloom in vast numbers, turning entire regions of the sea milky green or turquoise. These blooms can be seen from space, swirling patterns of color against the darker water. Each bloom is a feast, triggering population explosions in zooplankton, which in turn support fish and seabirds. The timing of these blooms matters. A shift of even a few weeks can disrupt the entire food chain, causing seabirds to arrive at nesting sites before food is available, or fish larvae to hatch into waters still barren of prey. The ocean also has a memory. Water that sank decades or centuries ago carries dissolved oxygen from that earlier time, preserves the isotopic composition of ancient rainfall, holds traces of volcanic eruptions and nuclear tests. By analyzing these chemical markers, scientists can trace the path water has taken, can estimate how long ago it was last at the surface, can reconstruct ocean circulation patterns from the past. Beneath the sunlit surface zone, in the twilight depths where light fades to nothing, organisms have evolved remarkable adaptations. Many produce their own light through bioluminescence, chemical reactions that generate a cold glow. Some use this light to attract prey, dangling luminous lures in front of their mouths. Others use it for camouflage, matching the faint downwelling light from above, so their silhouettes become invisible to predators looking up from below. Still others use bioluminescence for communication, flashing patterns that identify species, attract mates, or coordinate group behavior. In the darkness, these lights create a constantly shifting display, a silent conversation carried out in flashes and glows. Some fish have light organs beneath their eyes, biological headlights that allow them to see in the blackness. Others have evolved to detect different wavelengths, perceiving colors invisible to most creatures. The deep sea floor, once thought to be flat and monotonous, is now known to be as varied as any landscape on Earth. Underwater volcanoes rise from the abyssal plains, some extinct and weathered, others still active, building seamounts that can reach heights of thousands of feet. These seamounts create obstacles to deep currents, forcing water upward, bringing nutrients from the depths into shallower zones where they fertilize phytoplankton blooms. Canyons carved by ancient rivers, formed when sea levels were lower during ice ages, cut through continental slopes. These canyons channel sediment from the continents into the deep ocean, creating underwater avalanches called turbidity currents, flows of sediment-laden water that can travel at speeds of 50 miles per hour or more, carving the seafloor, depositing layers of sand and mud in the abyssal depths. The ocean is ancient, but its floor is young, constantly renewed by the slow but inexorable process of seafloor spreading, where tectonic plates pull apart. Magma wells up from the mantle, cooling to form new crust. This process has been happening for hundreds of millions of years, creating and destroying ocean basins, rearranging continents, shaping the face of the planet. To study the ocean is to study time itself. The water holds records of past climates, past catastrophes, past life. Ice cores drilled from polar ice sheets preserve bubbles of ancient atmosphere, but ocean sediments preserve an even longer record, layers of mud accumulating at rates of just a few millimeters per 1,000 years, building up histories that span millions of years. Each layer contains fossils of the organisms that lived when it was deposited, chemical signatures of the temperature and salinity of the water, traces of cosmic dust and volcanic ash. The ocean connects all things. A whale born in tropical waters may travel to polar feeding grounds, then return to the tropics to breed, crossing entire ocean basins in its annual migration. Eels spawn in the Sargasso Sea, their larvae drifting on currents to rivers in Europe and North America, where they mature before returning to the sea. Seabirds nest on remote islands, but range across thousands of miles of open ocean in search of food. Their movements link scattered ecosystems, transferring nutrients and energy across vast distances. And the ocean connects past to present to future. The carbon dioxide absorbed today will influence climate for generations. The plastic that enters the sea will persist for centuries, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments, but never truly disappearing. The decisions made now about fishing, about pollution, about coastal development will shape the ocean's health for decades to come. Yet the ocean also has a resilience, a capacity to recover when given the chance. Coral reefs, damaged by storms or bleaching events, can regrow if conditions improve. Fish populations, depleted by overfishing, can rebound when protected. Ecosystems that seemed on the verge of a collapse have proven capable of remarkable recovery when human pressure is reduced. The ocean remains, in many ways, as mysterious as it was to ancient sailors. Vast regions have never been visited by humans. Species are discovered regularly, sometimes in familiar waters that have been studied for decades. The deep sea holds secrets that may never be fully revealed, organisms living in sediments beneath the seafloor, chemical processes occurring at pressures we can barely replicate in laboratories, questions without answers. Perhaps that mystery is part of the ocean's essential nature. It is too vast, too deep, too dynamic to be fully known. Each answer leads to new questions. Each discovery reveals new puzzles. The ocean invites exploration while withholding final understanding, offering glimpses of its workings, but never complete clarity. As night falls over the ocean, the surface grows dark. Stars appear in the sky above. their light reflecting off the gently moving water. Below, in the depths, bioluminescent organisms begin their nightly displays, flashing and glowing in the darkness, creating light where no sunlight ever reaches. The waves continue their endless rhythm, rising and falling, breaking and reforming. Each wave travels across miles or even thousands of miles before it finally reaches shore, spending its energy in a rush of foam and spray before being pulled back into the sea. Currents flow in their ancient patterns, carrying water warmed at the equator toward the poles, bringing cold water from polar regions back toward the tropics. The great circulation continues, as it has for millions of years, redistributing heat, shaping climate, supporting life. In the deepest trenches, where no light has ever penetrated, creatures move slowly through the cold darkness, feeding on debris that drifts down from above, adapted to pressures that would crush most living things, thriving in an environment that seems utterly hostile, yet is, to them, simply home. On the abyssal plains, sediment continues to accumulate, grain by grain, building layers that will one day be studied by scientists seeking to understand this era. These sediments will preserve evidence of our time, traces of the chemicals we released, fragments of the materials we created, a record written in mud and shells, waiting to be read. The ocean holds the memory of the earth, records of past climates frozen in ice and locked in sediment, evidence of ancient life preserved in fossils, chemical signatures of volcanic eruptions and meteor impacts. The water itself has been part of countless cycles, evaporated from the surface, falling as rain, flowing through rivers back to the sea, over and over, for billions of years, and still the ocean moves. Tides rise and fall with the moon's pull. Waves march across the surface, driven by distant storms. Deep currents flow in their slow courses, carrying water on journeys that span centuries. The ocean is never still, never static, always changing while remaining fundamentally the same. In the quiet darkness, in the spaces between waves, the ocean continues its ancient work, absorbing sunlight, dissolving gases, supporting life, shaping the planet, regulating climate, connecting distant shores. It asks nothing, expects nothing, simply exists, vast and deep and incomprehensibly complex. The study of this realm, this blue expanse that covers most of our world, continues. New instruments reveal new details. New voyages explore unmapped regions. New questions arise from new observations. But the ocean itself remains beyond complete understanding, too large, too deep, too dynamic to ever be fully comprehended. And perhaps that is as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to endure. Some questions are more valuable than their answers. The ocean invites wonder, inspires curiosity, reminds us that there are still frontiers to explore, still discoveries waiting, still secrets held in the deep blue water. The waves continue, endless and eternal, rising and falling in their patient rhythm. The currents flow, invisible rivers in the sea. The depths hold their darkness, quiet and vast and full of life we are only beginning to understand. And the ocean breathes, drawing in air at the surface, releasing it again, part of the planet's great cycles, essential, ancient, enduring, forever moving beneath the sky.